Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. We're opening the pages of a story that whispers through marble halls and darkened villas, where power and madness sleep side by side. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. The Roman Empire was not yet 4 decades old when the world began to feel the tremors of unease. Rome, the city of marble and blood, stood as the beating heart of a realm that stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the cold forests of Germania. Its people were proud, its armies unmatched, and its streets alive with markets, temples, and gossip. But beneath the surface of triumph, the empire pulsed with quiet dread. For power in Rome was never safe, never gentle. It was sharpened like a dagger, passed from hand to hand, and always ready to strike. The man who ruled Rome when our story begins was not a warrior of the battlefield, nor a hero of legend. He was an old man, hidden away on an island, suspicious of everyone around him. His name was Tiberius, and though he wore the laurel crown of the Caesars, his reign had become a shadow, a rule built on fear, isolation, and silence. The Roman Empire was not yet 4 decades old when the world began to feel the tremors of unease. Rome, the city of marble and blood, stood as the beating heart of a realm that stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the cold forests of Germania. Its people were proud, its armies unmatched, and its streets alive with markets, temples, and gossip. But beneath the surface of triumph, the empire pulsed with quiet dread. For power in Rome was never safe, never gentle. It was sharpened like a dagger, passed from hand to hand, and always ready to strike. The man who ruled Rome when our story begins was not a warrior of the battlefield, nor a hero of legend. He was an old man, hidden away on an island, suspicious of everyone around him. His name was Tiberius, and though he wore the laurel crown of the Caesars, his reign had become a shadow, a rule built on fear, isolation, and silence. Tiberius had once been respected. He had commanded legions, pacified provinces, and upheld the legacy of Augustus, the first emperor. But time and bitterness changed him. He withdrew from the people he ruled, retreating to the cliffs and villas of Capri, where the sea spread endless and blue before him. From there, he sent letters to the Senate, gave orders to generals, and listened to whispers of treachery. Few saw his face, yet all felt his hand. The city of Rome trembled in his absence. Senators muttered in hushed tones, never knowing who among them carried reports back to Capri. Courtiers smiled too broadly, slaves listened too closely, and every street corner seemed to hold a spy. To live in Rome under Tiberius was to live beneath a veil of suspicion. A single word, a single rumour, could end with exile. Or worse. The people of the empire had grown restless. They had once cheered Augustus, who promised peace after a century of civil wars. They had once praised Tiberius when he brought stability. But now the peace felt heavy, suffocating, as though the empire's breath was caught in its chest. Something was missing. Something fiery. Something alive. And in the shadows of this uneasy calm, a boy was growing. A boy who would one day take the empire by storm. But before Caligula, there was a world already tilting toward madness. The empire itself seemed to embody contradictions. Rome was powerful, yet fragile. Its temples shone with offerings, yet its streets were littered with beggars. Gladiatorial games filled the amphitheatres, yet families wept for sons lost to hunger or war. Senators debated lofty ideals, but their hands reached eagerly for bribes. The imperial palace glittered, but blood was never far from its walls. Tiberius, away on Capri, left much of the daily terror in Rome to his prefect, Sejanus. A man of low birth who climbed high, Sejanus was ambitious, calculating, and merciless. He filled the city with trials, accusations, and executions. Families noble and ancient found themselves destroyed overnight. Houses were seized, reputations crushed, and names erased from memory. Citizens whispered that the prisons were crowded, that letters sealed in wax carried death within them, that no one could trust even their own kin. The empire was strong, yes, but it was a strength built on silence. And silence can be suffocating. It was into this silence that the memory of Augustus still loomed large. The people remembered him, the great founder of their empire. They remembered his triumphal arches, his golden age, his promise that Rome would last forever. And when they compared Augustus to the absent Tiberius, the old man on his island, they felt cheated. Rome was not meant to be ruled by a ghost. And so, whispers turned to prayers. Prayers for someone young, someone full of light, someone who could bring the glory of Augustus back to life. They looked at the children of Germanicus. Germanicus had been the shining star of Rome, a prince beloved by the people and the army alike. He had marched through Germania with the legions, avenging Rome's losses, carrying the eagle standards home. He had been handsome, brave, and merciful, everything a Roman wanted in a leader. His death, sudden and suspicious, cast a shadow over the empire. Many believed he had been poisoned on Tiberius's orders. His widow, Agrippina the Elder, fierce and proud, carried her grief like a banner. She returned to Rome with her children, a brood of potential heirs, sons and daughters of Germanicus. Among them was the boy called Gaius, though the soldiers gave him another name, Caligula, the little boots, for the tiny soldier's sandals he wore in camp. The people saw in these children the promise of renewal. But promises in Rome were dangerous things. Tiberius feared Germanicus's line. The children were watched, their mother harassed, their future uncertain. Accusations swirled, charges were raised, and exile became their fate. One by one, Germanicus's sons fell, some to death, some to imprisonment, some to starvation. Agrippina herself was driven to despair and ruin. But not all perished. The boy in the little boots survived. He grew in the shadow of tragedy, surrounded by whispers of betrayal, blood, and silence. He watched, he listened, he endured. And all the while, Rome waited. In the streets, meanwhile, life went on. Bakers kneaded their dough at dawn. Merchants shouted in the forum. Gladiators oiled their bodies before the games. Senators in white togas walked proudly, but always with a glance over their shoulders. Mothers told their children to speak softly, to never repeat what was heard at home. The empire was alive, yet tense, like a string pulled too tightly. The provinces felt it too. From Judea to Hispania, from Gaul to Egypt, the weight of Roman rule pressed down. Governors collected taxes, soldiers marched, and distant peoples sent tribute. But everywhere, men wondered who truly commanded Rome now. The absent Tiberius? The ruthless Sejanus? Or the shadow of Augustus that refused to fade? The uncertainty was dangerous, for uncertainty invites hope, and hope in Rome could be deadly. On Capri, the emperor grew stranger. Rumours spread that he surrounded himself with astrologers, magicians, and pleasures best left unspoken. His retreat became a symbol of excess, of a ruler cut off from his people. Rome did not see him, but it felt his absence like a wound. When Sejanus finally fell, when his ambition overreached and Tiberius crushed him, the city reeled. Thousands who had once bowed to Sejanus now scrambled to prove loyalty to the emperor. The prisons overflowed again. The executions resumed. Heads rolled in the forum, and the people learned once more that safety was an illusion. It was in this climate, this mixture of fear, yearning, and decay, that Caligula's name began to rise. A world on edge. That is what Rome was before Caligula. A city where silence carried daggers, where the sea winds of Capri carried orders of death, where the memory of Augustus mocked the weakness of his heir. A city where the people longed for light, but were surrounded by shadows. And somewhere, in the heart of that shadow, a boy was growing into the man who would become their emperor. The empire, vast and glittering, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm. The empire that waited for a saviour did not know the shape that saviour would take. Hidden behind palace doors, a boy watched, listened, and learned. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but history would not remember him that way. To the soldiers who had once cradled him in their arms, who had strapped miniature sandals to his feet, and laughed at the sight of a child marching alongside them, he was Caligula, Little Boots. The name would cling to him, playful at first, mocking later, immortal at last. He was born into blood, into the very heart of Rome's dynastic struggle. His father was Germanicus, the Golden General, beloved of the legions and the people. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, proud, fierce, and never silent. From the moment of his birth, he was both heir and target, for in Rome, children of promise were never safe. As a toddler, Gaius lived among soldiers. Germanicus carried him through camps on the Rhine, presenting him not as a fragile child, but as a symbol of Rome's strength. The legions adored the little boy. They saw in him a future commander, a bloodline blessed by the gods. When they chanted his name, their voices thundered louder than the drums of war. The child smiled, unaware of how deeply such adoration would mark him. But childhood in Rome was never a place of innocence. Death and ambition lurked at every corner. While other boys played in gardens or studied letters under tutors, Gaius absorbed the weight of empire. He watched the discipline of soldiers, the cruelty of punishments, the hunger in men's eyes when they looked at power. He was never simply a child. He was a symbol, a pawn, a shadow of his father's glory. Germanicus's death would change everything. The boy was only 7 when word came from the east. Germanicus, so young, so full of promise, had fallen ill. The rumours spread faster than truth. Poison, betrayal, the hand of Tiberius behind it. Rome wept, soldiers tore their garments, women offered sacrifices for his soul. For Agrippina and her children, the loss was more than grief. It was a sentence. They returned to Rome not as a family honoured, but as a family watched. Agrippina's defiance, her refusal to bow quietly, made her dangerous. She carried Germanicus's memory like a torch, and torches in Rome often set fire to thrones. The boy Gaius saw it all, the suspicion in the eyes of the Senate, the thin smiles of courtiers, the whispers in the forum. He was learning quickly. To survive in Rome was not to trust. At night, he must have listened to his mother's voice, filled with fury, warning her children of betrayal. She told them who their enemies were. She reminded them of their bloodline, of their father's greatness, of the throne that was theirs by right. Her lessons were not soft. They were sharpened by grief, carved by rage. A child absorbs such lessons deeply, even if he does not yet understand them. The shadows thickened around the family. Agrippina was accused, harassed, silenced. Her children suffered beside her. Two of Gaius's brothers, Nero and Drusus, would not live to see manhood. One died imprisoned, starved in chains. The other wasted away in despair. Gaius, small and watchful, remained. Why did he survive where others did not? Perhaps because he was quiet. Perhaps because he hid behind wide eyes and careful words. Or perhaps the gods, cruel and mocking, had plans for him. Gaius spent time on Capri, summoned by Tiberius himself. The old emperor, weary and suspicious, kept the boy close, as though proximity would neutralize the threat of his bloodline. Capri was no paradise. Its cliffs were steep, its waters deep, and its halls filled with whispers of indulgence. Tiberius's court was a place of pleasure and corruption, where secrets were traded like coins, and fear was the language of survival. Here the boy learned silence. He watched the emperor, studied his moods, measured his words carefully. He saw how men bowed too low, laughed too quickly, lied too easily. He learned that power was not always about strength. It was about perception, about masks worn and masks removed. A boy who grows in such an atmosphere does not grow soft. He grows hidden, coiled, waiting. Those who later spoke of Caligula's madness often wondered if it began here, on Capri, in the company of an emperor whose own mind seemed clouded. They told stories of the things Gaius saw, of the games played in darkened rooms, of the cruelty that masked itself as amusement. Whether truth or exaggeration, such tales cling to him. For a child who watches too much learns that the world is not guided by justice, but by desire and fear. Education was never far from cruelty. Gaius studied the words of poets, the speeches of Cicero, the laws of Rome. He read of gods and heroes, of the founding of the city, of Alexander the Great, whose shadow haunted every Roman ruler. But alongside these lessons, he learned darker truths. He learned how quickly a man's name could be condemned. He learned that exile was often a slower death than the sword. He learned that survival depended not on virtue, but on cunning. The boy was not loud. He did not fight openly. He moved like a shadow, speaking when spoken to, smiling when expected, obeying when watched. But inside, the lessons gathered like storm clouds. And a storm, once begun, waits only for the moment to break. The people of Rome still remembered him. They remembered the child in soldier's boots, the son of Germanicus, the boy who had walked camps with the legions. In their hearts, he was a symbol of hope, though they did not know what kind of hope. Some saw him as the heir of Augustus's golden age, others as a tool to weaken Tiberius's grip. To Gaius himself, these expectations were heavy chains, chains he would one day shake off violently. But for now, he was still the boy in the shadows. The palace whispered constantly. Slaves carried rumours from hall to hall. Senators measured every glance. Soldiers kept their swords polished, unsure who might fall next. In such an environment, a child does not dream of games or laughter. He dreams of survival, of masks to wear, of secrets to hold close. The loss of his brothers etched itself deep into him. Each death was not just a wound, but a warning. He learned not to trust bonds of blood, for even family could be destroyed by suspicion. He learned that Rome itself was an enemy, its glittering stones hiding daggers in every corner. He learned to smile while mourning, to bow while hating, to wait while others perished. And in waiting, he hardened. By the time adolescence came, Gaius had grown into a figure of contradictions. He was small, almost delicate, yet his eyes carried a weight too heavy for his age. He could charm with a laugh, but the laughter never touched his gaze. He could speak sweetly, but the sweetness was always measured. Those who knew him described him as both obedient and calculating, as if two selves lived within him, the boy who survived and the man who would emerge. Capri, with its cliffs and its sea, became his cage. But cages do more than confine. They shape. They remind the caged creature of freedom lost, of flight denied, of power withheld. And when such a creature is finally released, it does not fly gently. It lashes, it claws, it claims. The boy in the shadows grew into a man watched by the empire. Rome was still restless. The people still longed for a spark of life, for the promise of a new Augustus. They whispered the name of Germanicus' son with cautious hope, and though Gaius did not yet rule, he could feel the eyes of the empire pressing on him. Every gesture, every word, every silence became part of his image. He was being carved not by his own hand, but by the expectations of millions. And yet, within him, the lessons of childhood remained. The soldier's cheers, his mother's fury, the brothers lost, the emperor's gaze, the shadows of Capri. They did not fade. They coiled together, shaping the boy into something the world had not yet seen. In the stillness of youth, something dangerous was forming. The empire, vast and uneasy, continued its march through time. Provinces sent their tribute. Armies guarded the borders. Senators bickered under painted ceilings. And far away, on an island of cliffs and whispers, a boy watched it all, silent and patient. The boy in the shadows would not remain a boy forever. The boy who had grown in shadows carried with him a memory brighter than the torches of Capri, a memory older than his grief and his fear. It was the sound of soldiers laughing, the weight of leather straps tied around his tiny feet, the smell of smoke and iron in the air of the frontier camps. Before he was marked by tragedy, before he was watched like prey, Gaius was known by a different name. One born not in the whispers of courtiers, but in the rough affection of legionaries. They called him Caligula, Little Boots. His father had carried him across the Rhine, not hidden in palaces, but exposed to mud, rain, and marching men. Germanicus had trusted the legions with his son, and in return, they adored the child. Imagine a boy, no more than 3 or 4 years old, dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform. A tunic too small, a tiny belt at his waist, and boots, caligae, strapped to his feet, the kind worn by the common legionary. The men roared with delight when they saw him. In the heart of their marches, in the smoke of their camps, the little boy marched with them. The soldiers teased him, lifted him onto their shoulders, and gave him a name of their own. Caligula, they called him. Little Boots. The sound echoed across the camps like a song, and the boy, barely old enough to understand, smiled. He belonged to them, a symbol of Germanicus's blood, a living promise that the glory of their beloved general would not die. The nickname clung to him. It was affectionate, almost mocking, but filled with warmth. To the legions, it was a badge of kinship. To Gaius, it was a memory of laughter in a childhood otherwise marked by grief. And like all names born in love or jest, it carried a weight far greater than anyone could have imagined. The boots themselves were simple things. Heavy soles studded with hobnails, leather straps winding up the calves. They were the shoes of men who walked hundreds of miles under armour, who dug trenches, who built roads, who bled for Rome on cold mornings and blazing afternoons. For a child to wear them was more than a costume. It was a bond with the men who made the empire's victories possible. The legionaries saw in the boy something more than innocence. They saw continuity. For the Roman soldier, loyalty to a commander was stronger than loyalty to a distant senate or emperor. Germanicus had been their commander, their hero. When he died, a piece of their spirit was buried with him. But Caligula, the child in boots, reminded them of their lost general. He was like a spark from Germanicus's fire, too small to blaze yet, but glowing, waiting. It is strange how names born of affection can turn into weapons. Caligula was never meant as a title of power. It was a soldier's jest, a fieldside nickname. Yet when the boy became a man, the name would cling to him, mocking him in marble halls where laughter had long turned cruel. But as a child, he cherished it. Perhaps it was the only time he was loved not for his bloodline, not for what he might become, but for who he was in that moment. A boy running between tents, boots clattering against the dirt, a smile breaking across a face that had not yet hardened. In those camps, he learned things books could not teach. He learned the smell of discipline, the sweat of men drilled into formation until every step fell in unison. He learned the language of wounds, the way soldiers bore pain without complaint. He learned the sound of oaths sworn not to gods or emperors, but to brothers in arms. These lessons settled quietly into him. The boy was not yet a ruler, not yet a monster, but he was already absorbing the spirit of the men who marched in iron boots. The soldiers loved him because he was Germanicus's son. But the boy, wide-eyed and curious, must have loved them too. They were rough, scarred, weathered, but their affection was genuine, untainted by politics. They lifted him, teased him, shared their bread. For a child marked by betrayal in the palace, the camps must have felt like a different world, a place where loyalty meant something real. When the family returned from the frontiers, the nickname followed. It clung to him in the streets of Rome, whispered by citizens who remembered the stories of the boy in boots. It was not always kind. In the polished marble corridors of the city, Caligula sounded childish, ridiculous, a reminder of mud and camps far from the capital's dignity. To patricians and senators, it was a joke. How could Rome one day be ruled by little boots? But nicknames, once given, rarely die. And though Gaius bristled at it in his later years, history would never let it go. The loss of his father and brothers hung heavily over these memories. Germanicus's death left the child's soldier identity half-formed, like an unfinished sculpture. The boots he wore became a relic of what might have been. For had Germanicus lived, Caligula's childhood might have continued among the legions, shaped by honour and discipline. Instead, fate wrenched him away, delivering him into the suffocating grip of palace politics. Yet the soldiers did not forget. Even years later, when he was older, when he walked through barracks or reviewed troops, they cheered not Gaius, but Caligula. The sound must have cut him, both sweet and bitter, a reminder of love lost and innocence gone. What does it mean for a boy to be named by soldiers? It means his earliest sense of identity is tied not to softness, but to iron, not to laughter of children, but to the marching of men. He was raised not with toys, but with weapons at his side, not with lullabies, but with chants shouted in rhythm. Such beginnings shape the mind. They make one restless, hungering for command, unable to sit in silence while the world moves without them. The boy's smile in the camps would one day harden into the smile of an emperor who demanded absolute loyalty. The laughter of soldiers lifting him onto their shoulders would one day echo in the hollow cheers of crowds forced to worship him. The nickname that once rang with affection would one day mock him, as if fate itself enjoyed cruel jokes. But in those early days, Caligula was still only a boy in boots, adored by men who saw in him their future. The empire, meanwhile, pressed on. Rome itself buzzed with stories of Germanicus's campaigns, of victories won and losses avenged. Merchants told tales of the little boy who wore soldiers' boots, spreading his name like legend across taverns and marketplaces. To the people, the image of the child in uniform was charming, almost divine, as though the gods themselves had marked him. And yet, within the palaces, such stories were dangerous. For in Rome, to be loved by soldiers was not a blessing, it was a threat. The Senate remembered well how legions had once elevated Julius Caesar, how soldiers' loyalty could topple governments. Tiberius, watching from his island retreat, surely felt unease at the popularity of Germanicus's son. A boy adored by soldiers was a seed of rebellion, even if that boy wore only tiny boots. Thus affection became suspicion. Laughter became fear. And the nickname that began in the mud of frontier camps became a quiet reminder of a power the boy did not yet wield, but one day would. As Gaius grew, the boots no longer fit. He left them behind, yet the name remained. Every step he took was haunted by it, a shadow of his childhood clinging to his adulthood. He could not escape it, no matter how he tried. The empire had chosen his name for him, and the empire never forgets. The soldiers had given him more than leather and hobnails. They had given him identity. They had given him memory. And they had unknowingly given him the weight of expectation. For a boy named by soldiers must one day prove himself worthy of their cheers, or else twist their affection into fear. The boy in boots was becoming a man, and the empire, still restless, still waiting, was watching. The sound of boots that once clattered joyfully in the camps gave way to silence within marble corridors. The laughter of soldiers, the warmth of legionary affection, faded like a dream. The boy who had been raised among men of iron was returned to Rome, and there the walls of the palace closed around him like a snare. For the palace was no home. It was a stage for suspicion, a theatre of whispered accusations. And in those halls, the blood of family was as dangerous as the sword of an enemy. Gaius was still young when he learned how fragile a family could be. Germanicus, his father, was long dead. His mother, Agrippina, fierce and unbending, carried her grief like a weapon. She did not hide her anger at Tiberius, the emperor who watched from Capri, cold and distant. She believed her husband had been murdered, poisoned at the command of the old ruler, and she said so loudly. In Rome, to speak such words was to invite death. Yet Agrippina spoke them still. Her defiance was fire, and fire always draws the eyes of those who fear it. Tiberius did not strike openly at first. He allowed suspicion to do the work for him. Spies lingered at banquets. Scribes noted every word. Servants carried whispers from chamber to chamber. The name of Agrippina was turned against her, painted as proud, arrogant, dangerous. A woman who would not bow was called an enemy of the state. For her children, this meant a life shaped by dread. Gaius watched his mother move through the city with guarded steps, watched her argue with officials, watched her pride bring both admiration and doom. He was old enough to feel the weight of fear, but young enough to crave the security of her arms. Yet Agrippina's arms were always reaching outward, pointing at enemies, accusing shadows. A child raised in such a house does not grow soft. He grows sharp, always ready to notice betrayal before it strikes. The family was marked for ruin. First came the brothers. Nero, the eldest, a youth of promise, was accused of conspiracy. The charges were vague, as charges often were in Rome: plots against the emperor, disloyal words, ambition that should not be spoken aloud. He was sent away, cut off from the city, and there he wasted in exile. His name was stripped, his honour erased. He died far from Rome, a prisoner not of walls but of distance, abandoned and forgotten. Drusus, another of Gaius's brothers, faced the same fate. They said he starved to death, confined, broken not by the sword, but by silence and hunger. A prince of Rome, a son of Germanicus, reduced to nothing more than a body wasting in darkness. The boy who would be Caligula saw these things, heard the stories, felt the absence. Each death was a wound carved into his soul, but also a lesson. Rome did not need open battle to destroy a family. It could choke the life from its heirs with nothing more than paper, seals and accusations. Blood could be spilled without a blade ever being drawn. His mother followed. Agrippina's defiance did not dim. When her sons were taken, she cried out louder. When her honour was questioned, she answered with rage. She accused Tiberius himself of cruelty, of treachery. And the emperor, who ruled from Capri, heard every word. He could not allow her fire to burn unchecked. They exiled her too. She, the proud daughter of Augustus's blood, the widow of Rome's golden general, was sent to a barren island, cut off from her children, stripped of dignity. There she wasted, her pride turned to bitterness, her body weakened by grief. She starved herself, some say willingly, others say broken by despair. Either way, her fire was extinguished. For Gaius, the boy who had once marched in miniature boots, the loss of mother and brothers was not only sorrow, it was betrayal, written in the language of Rome itself. The empire that had once cheered his father had destroyed his family, piece by piece, with legal decrees and whispered charges. He was left standing amid ruins, the last surviving son, the boy in the shadows. The palace itself became a place of shifting sands. Once, the name of Germanicus had filled the city with pride. Now it was a curse whispered cautiously. To be connected to him was dangerous, for it meant you carried a spark of popularity that the emperor could not trust. The very love of the people, once a blessing, had become poison. Gaius learned to hide. He learned to smile when eyes were upon him, to flatter when he was tested, to silence his heart when his family was cursed in public. This silence was survival. But silence is never empty. In silence, memories sharpen. In silence, grief turns to steel. In silence, the mind begins to imagine the day when masks can finally fall. He spent time close to Tiberius, the emperor who had destroyed his family. Capri became both cage and classroom. The boy was watched, measured, tested. Some said Tiberius kept him close to control him, others that he feared leaving him free. Gaius endured, swallowing words, bowing his head, hiding his anger beneath the surface of obedience. It is here that the seeds of cruelty may have been sown. For to live among cruelty is to learn it. To watch betrayal is to understand its power. To see family destroyed, not by strangers, but by kin, is to lose faith in bonds of love. A boy raised in such an atmosphere does not dream of kindness. He dreams of revenge, even if the dream is silent. The city of Rome, meanwhile, whispered of these tragedies. Citizens knew the fate of Germanicus's sons. They spoke of Agrippina's exile with pity and fear. They saw in Gaius a child marked by both fortune and doom. He was alive, yes, but at what cost? Survival in Rome was rarely pure. To survive often meant to bend, to bow, to play roles one did not choose. And Gaius had learned to play his role well. But within the palace walls, blood had already soaked the marble. Brothers starved, mothers exiled, families shattered. The boy who remained was both orphaned and crowned by tragedy. He was not yet emperor, not yet mad, not yet the figure who would plunge Rome into fear. But he was already marked. Blood in the palace was not only spilled in secret cells or distant exiles. It lingered in the very air. Servants knew it. Senators knew it. The emperor himself knew it. The palace was not marble. It was a grave dressed in finery. To walk its corridors was to breathe betrayal, to taste suspicion. And for a boy forced to grow in its shadows, the lessons were unforgettable. Every step Gaius took reminded him of loss. Every smile he gave was a mask. Every silence he kept was a shield. He was a survivor in a place that killed survivors. And so, when the time would come for him to rise, when the people would cheer his name and crown him with power, he would not come as an innocent heir. He would come as the last child of a family destroyed, as a man forged by suspicion, as a ruler who had watched too much blood flow in the palace to ever believe in mercy. The boy in boots had grown into the boy in shadows. The boy in shadows was now something else entirely. A young man who had learned that survival was only the first step, and that vengeance waited behind it. The marble of the palace in Rome was cold, but the stones of Capri were colder still. High above the sea, where cliffs fell sheer into waves that foamed and broke against jagged rock, the emperor had built his retreat, or his prison. Perhaps it was both. Capri was beautiful, yes. The turquoise water, the scent of pines carried on the wind, the caves carved by the sea into secret grottos. But beauty in the hands of a man like Tiberius became something darker. The island was not an escape from Rome, it was Rome stripped bare, a theatre of suspicion and cruelty, where the emperor ruled without witnesses but the waves. It was here that Gaius, the boy now hardened by grief, found himself summoned. He was no longer simply the child of Germanicus, no longer the shadow orphan, moving through Rome's corridors with silent steps. He was brought into the presence of Tiberius himself, the man whose orders had erased his brothers, who had exiled his mother, who ruled with eyes that saw only treachery. And so the boy was transformed into something else, an heir in waiting. Tiberius was not loved. He had been emperor for years, but Rome did not adore him as it had Augustus. His reign was marked not by pageantry and triumph, but by retreat, suspicion, and silence. He no longer walked the forum or addressed the Senate in person. He ruled from Capri, sending letters, sealing fates from afar. His absence left a vacuum in Rome, a hollow at the heart of power. Yet on Capri, he reigned absolutely, surrounded by soldiers, advisors, and victims. The island itself had begun to acquire a reputation. To the common people, whispers grew of orgies and cruelty, of boys and girls taken for the emperor's pleasure, of men hurled from cliffs for minor offences. Whether every rumour was true mattered little. The air was heavy with fear. Capri was not a palace. It was a lair. And in that lair, Caligula learned how an emperor could turn paradise into a dungeon. The emperor was aging, his face carved with lines, his body still strong but weary. Yet his mind never ceased to calculate. Tiberius had no clear heir. His own son, Drusus, was dead, poisoned, some said, in another web of palace intrigue. Germanicus's sons, Gaius's brothers, had been removed. The imperial family was thinned, pared down like branches cut from a tree. Only a few remained, and among them, the boy in boots. Gaius was dangerous, and Tiberius knew it. He was the child of Germanicus, loved by the legions, remembered by the people. His name carried echoes of hope and of vengeance. To kill him outright might provoke anger, but to keep him close was safer, safer, and more useful, and so the boy became part of Capri's theatre. He learned to survive under the emperor's gaze. Every smile, every bow, every word was weighed. To show defiance was death. To show too much eagerness was suspicion. Caligula mastered the art of appearing harmless. He laughed when laughter was expected. He offered small kindnesses to those around him. He behaved as though he were nothing more than a docile youth grateful for the emperor's favour. But within, he was watching, always watching. The island offered lessons beyond politics. Here, cruelty was performed not in whispers, but in acts. Senators accused of treason were summoned, questioned, condemned. Some were strangled, others starved, some thrown from cliffs. The sea below became a tomb, swallowing bodies before the city could mourn them. And Gaius, still young, stood in these chambers, silent, his eyes fixed, his lips unmoving. He absorbed it all. Fear was the language of Capri. Even the emperor's closest advisers trembled in his presence, for the line between favour and execution was razor thin. A jest taken poorly, a rumour overheard, a careless word, any of these could end in death. And the boy who would be Caligula walked among this fear like a shadow, learning that survival meant becoming unreadable, a mirror that reflected whatever face the emperor wanted to see. Yet even in cruelty, there was perverse indulgence. The island was alive with rumours of feasts where restraint was abandoned, of pleasures taken without shame, of orgies held in chambers lit by oil lamps while the sea roared below. Tiberius had retreated from Rome's judgment, and in Capri's isolation, the boundaries of dignity dissolved. It was said that he demanded the presence of boys and girls at his table, that he used them for entertainments unspoken. It was said he revelled in grotesque games, humiliating those who served him. And there, too, was Gaius, surrounded by excess, surrounded by cruelty, watching the emperor indulge without fear of consequence. To a boy whose family had been crushed by that same man, the lesson was clear. Power was not bound by morality. Power could bend reality itself. But power also brought paranoia. Tiberius feared plots. He feared daggers hidden in robes, poison mixed in wine. He feared the Senate, the people, even those who swore loyalty. On Capri, he trusted no one fully, not even his own blood. This paranoia bled into Gaius's existence. The boy lived every day under the possibility of sudden death. A gesture misread, a smile taken as arrogance, a careless word, any could bring an end. He walked the halls like one moving across a rope stretched above an abyss. The balance was delicate, the stakes absolute, and yet he endured. More than endured, he flourished. Tiberius, for all his suspicion, found himself charmed. Gaius was clever, obedient, careful. He did not provoke. He did not plot openly. He played the role of loyal ward with skill. Some whispered that the emperor grew fond of him, that he saw in the boy a reflection of youth long gone. Others whispered that it was only calculation, that Tiberius meant to shape him into a ruler cut from his own mould. The island of fear became the forge of an heir. Gaius learned patience, the art of masking thought, the craft of bending without breaking. He learned that in Rome, survival came not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. He learned that cruelty was not an accident of power, but its natural companion. And he learned, above all, to wait. For Tiberius was old, his years heavy. He could not rule forever. The island was his fortress, but fortresses eventually fall, not by storming, but by time itself. And when time took him, someone would inherit. Who else remained? The family had been cut away, branch by branch. The tree stood bare. Only one figure cast a shadow across the palace floors. Gaius. The waves at Capri never ceased. They crashed against the cliffs with endless rhythm, as though the sea itself remembered every body hurled into its depths. And as they roared, the boy who had once been mocked as Little Boots stood silently beside the emperor who had destroyed his kin. He watched. He waited. He smiled. The island had taught him well. It had taught him that blood spilled in palaces is not wasted, it is transformed. It had taught him that cruelty, once endured, can be turned outward. It had taught him that the role of heir is not only to succeed, but to survive long enough to claim what others cannot. And so, as the emperor aged in his retreat, Rome itself waited. Senators whispered of succession, soldiers whispered of loyalty, the people whispered of hope or fear. All eyes turned not toward the weary ruler on the cliffs, but toward the quiet figure standing in his shadow, an heir in waiting. The sea had been restless in those last days. Capri's waves struck the cliffs harder, as though the island itself sensed that something was ending. The old emperor, Tiberius, grew weaker. His face, once hardened like stone, now seemed a mask that clung too loosely to the bone. His breath rattled at night, echoing in the chambers where no one dared disturb him. He had ruled Rome from a distance, from this fortress above the waves, but distance cannot hold back death. Time had been patient, and now it pressed upon him with a weight heavier than any enemy's sword. Gaius watched. He had grown tall, his features sharpened by years of silent observation. The boy in boots was gone. In his place stood a young man who had learned to smile without revealing thought, to obey without surrendering his will. On Capri, he had witnessed cruelty refined into an art, indulgence unshackled from shame, and fear wielded as easily as a blade. Tiberius had given him no throne, but he had given him something far more enduring, a masterclass in power. The old emperor lingered, clinging to life with a stubbornness that mirrored the way he had once clung to rule. Some said he wished to name Gaius his successor. Others whispered he favoured Gemellus, his own grandson. But Tiberius was not a man to declare plainly. He revelled in uncertainty, leaving rivals to gnaw at one another, leaving Rome in a state of waiting that was itself a form of torment. Yet even masters of suspicion cannot script their end. The moment arrived in quiet. Tiberius, heavy with age, fell into sleep one evening and did not rise with the dawn. His body lay still, the chambers hushed but for the rush of waves below. For a time there was confusion. Was he gone, or merely resting? Those close to him hesitated, afraid to proclaim death too soon. To declare it while breath still lingered would mean their own destruction. And so the silence stretched, until it became clear that the emperor would not open his eyes again. What followed was not grief, but calculation. Power does not wait for morning. Orders had to be given, guards secured, messages prepared. The fate of Rome balanced on what words would be spoken in those first moments after the emperor's fall. It was then that Gaius stepped forward. He had spent years learning when to speak, when to remain silent, when to smile, when to lower his eyes. Now, at last, he no longer had to lower them. The palace looked to him, and he did not falter. The Senate in Rome received the news with mixed emotions. Tiberius had been respected, feared, even obeyed, but he had never been beloved. His withdrawal to Capri had left the capital uneasy, a city ruled by letters rather than presence. Senators who had once trembled under his suspicion now felt their shoulders lighten, but freedom was not theirs to claim. A new name had already been whispered, Gaius Caesar, son of Germanicus. The legions remembered Germanicus. They remembered the commander who had marched with them through mud and blood, who had shared their hardships, who had been taken too soon. To them, Gaius was not simply another Julio-Claudian heir. He was the blood of their general, the child who had worn a tiny soldier's outfit in their camps, the boy who had been their mascot. They had called him Caligula, Little Boots, and though the nickname clung, it carried warmth. To the soldiers, he was family. And so when word spread that the boy in boots was now the man of Rome, the legions rejoiced. The people too greeted the news with cries of celebration. For years they had lived under the shadow of Tiberius's paranoia, under the silence of Capri. Now they saw hope in a youthful face, in a name tied to Germanicus's memory. The forum filled with shouts, sacrifices burned on altars, garlands draped across temples. Rome had its prince. Caligula entered the city not as a stranger, but as a promise. The crowds surged to see him, pressing close as his litter moved through the streets. Flowers were thrown, praises shouted, tears shed openly. To many, it felt as though the golden age of Augustus had returned, as though the spirit of Germanicus had been reborn in his son. The people cheered not only for the emperor they now had, but for the father they still remembered. The Senate bowed low. They granted him titles, powers, honores, eager to bind themselves to his favour. Caligula accepted with grace, his voice calm, his gestures generous. He was young, charming, even playful in his manner. To the senators who had survived Tiberius's reign of suspicion, it was a relief. Here was no brooding figure on a cliff, no distant ruler who ruled by fear. Here was a prince who smiled. Yet beneath the smile lay lessons carved deep by the island of fear. Caligula knew what faces pleased the world, and he wore them easily. But he also knew that beneath every acclamation was ambition. Beneath every bow was calculation. He had seen how swiftly fortune turned, how easily a beloved figure could become a condemned one. He carried that knowledge with him into Rome, unseen but never forgotten. The first months of his reign seemed to justify the people's adoration. He was generous with games and spectacles, giving the city the entertainments it craved. Gladiators clashed beneath the eyes of roaring crowds. Chariot wheels tore the Circus Maximus into thunder. Exotic animals were brought from far corners of the empire. Bread and spectacle, always the surest path to Rome's heart. He also honoured his family. Statues of Germanicus were restored, his memory praised. His mother, Agrippina, though long gone, was publicly remembered with dignity. Even his brothers, who had perished in the coils of palace intrigue, were granted honours. It was as though Caligula sought to right the wrongs of Tiberius's cruelty, to heal wounds that had festered for years. Rome adored him all the more. Coins bore his image, temples echoed with prayers for his health, and streets sang with his name. He was young, he was generous, he was the child of Germanicus. To the people, he was more than emperor, he was salvation. But power has a way of revealing what lies beneath. The city whispered of the illness that struck him early in his reign. For weeks he lay near death, fever consuming him, his body weak. Rome held its breath. Senators prayed not from devotion but from fear. What chaos would erupt if their new prince fell so soon? The people wept openly, fearing they would lose him before they had truly known him. When he recovered, there was joy, but there was also a shift. Some say the fever altered him, that the brush with death left him changed. Others whisper that the illness only revealed what had always been hidden beneath the charm. Whatever the truth, his rule after that illness began to tilt. The smile remained, but it no longer reached as far into the eyes. His laughter grew sharper, his generosity edged with demands. The sudden prince had survived death once. Perhaps he believed he could never be touched again. In the Senate, whispers grew cautious. Caligula began to test them, to remind them that their loyalty was not optional. He demanded honours beyond those of Augustus, pushed for gestures that bordered on worship. Temples were adorned not just for gods, but for their emperor himself. Statues were raised in his image, some even with divine attributes. Senators bowed lower, not from respect, but from fear of what refusal might bring. And in private, indulgence deepened. The island of Capri had shown him what could be done when no one dared resist. Now, with Rome itself at his feet, the stage was larger, the audience grander, and the acts darker. Orgies spilled into the night, feasts blurred into excess, desires once whispered became commands. He had inherited not only the throne, but the appetites of those who had ruled before him. Sharpened by years of watching and waiting, the sudden prince had become emperor, but he had not become secure. Every shadow in Rome seemed to move with hidden intent. Every senator's bow concealed a dagger. Every cheer from the crowd could shift to jeers in a heartbeat. He knew it. He had learned it on Capri. And so, while he indulged, while he displayed generosity, while he accepted adoration, he also sharpened his cruelty. For the island of fear had taught him one truth above all: power is safest when others tremble. And soon, Rome would tremble. When the news spread that Tiberius was dead, and Gaius, the young man whom Rome still fondly called Caligula, had taken the throne, the city seemed to breathe again. For years the people had lived under the suffocating grip of an emperor who never appeared in public, who ruled from afar with suspicion and terror. Tiberius had been like a storm that never broke, heavy and brooding, always ready to unleash punishment upon those he imagined were plotting against him. His death was greeted as though the sun itself had returned after a long eclipse, and into that sunlight stepped Caligula. He was only 24, vibrant, handsome, and brimming with a charm that seemed to pour out of him like honey. For Romans who had known nothing but suspicion and whispers, here was an emperor who laughed, who spoke to them in the forum, who organised games, who opened the prisons and welcomed back the exiles. He called himself their son, their brother, their friend. It was as if Rome had been led out of a dungeon and into a festival. The Senate, too, rejoiced. These were men who had cowered under Tiberius, writing cautious letters, never daring to speak their minds, always wary that a careless word might summon a charge of treason. Now, Caligula embraced them. He stood before them, young and radiant, promising to restore their dignity, to revive the traditions of the Republic, to listen and to share power. Senators wept in relief. Some believed the gods had blessed Rome anew, but it was not only words. In his first months, Caligula showered Rome with generosity. He arranged grand games, the sort the people had only dreamed of during Tiberius's reclusion. Chariots thundered around the Circus Maximus. Gladiators fought with renewed ferocity. Exotic animals from Africa were paraded and sacrificed. The people cheered, and Caligula smiled as though each cheer were a prayer answered. He reduced taxes. He gave gifts of money to the masses. He paid off debts long ignored. To the poor and hungry, he was not simply an emperor. He was salvation itself. Statues were raised, not the cold, lifeless statues of emperors past, but ones where Caligula's youth and vitality seemed to radiate. Poets sang of him, likening him to Augustus reborn. Women swooned at the sight of him. Men admired his courage and grace. Even soldiers, hardened from campaigns along the Rhine, saw in him the promise of victories to come. For a fleeting moment, Rome believed it had found not merely a ruler, but a saviour. Yet beneath the golden smiles lay something darker, though few noticed it at first. Caligula's kindness was not steady or measured. It was extravagant, theatrical, almost feverish. He did not give as a father to his children. He gave as though he needed the roar of gratitude to feel something hollow within himself. He basked in the adoration of the crowd, but behind his eyes some saw a glimmer that unsettled them, like sunlight on the edge of a blade. Still, the illusion of kindness held. He honoured his dead mother and brothers with funerals so magnificent that Rome had not seen their equal in generations. He carried their ashes himself, weeping openly before the people. The city mourned with him, sharing in his sorrow, feeling closer to him for his display of tenderness. It was a gesture that bound Rome to him, not with chains of fear, but with ties of affection. And yet, while he honoured the dead, the living were made to tremble in secret. He whispered to certain senators in private, testing their loyalty, watching their faces. Those who flinched or hesitated found themselves removed, exiled quietly under vague accusations. Few dared to speak of it, for the kindness of Caligula was so dazzling in public that any tale of cruelty seemed unbelievable. Was it not the same youth who embraced orphans, who fed the poor, who staged games for the people's delight? The contradiction was too sharp for most to see. There were nights when Rome was lit not only by torches, but by Caligula's banquets. At these feasts, he played the role of generous host, pouring wine, laughing, tossing coins to the servants, telling stories with a boyish charm that disarmed even the wary. Yet the feasts also revealed the first shadows of excess. Dishes grew stranger and more lavish, peacock tongues, gilded bread, pearls dissolved in wine. To some, it was marvel. To others, it was unease. For generosity that knows no measure is kin to madness that knows no bounds. He began to toy with the boundaries of reverence too. At first it was subtle. He allowed statues of himself to be placed among the gods, not as equal, but as if to suggest divinity brushed against him. He smiled when priests spoke of him in sacred tones, as though amused by their audacity. But Rome, hungry for a golden age, accepted it. After all, was he not young, radiant, and merciful? Could it not be that the gods had indeed touched him? In these months, Caligula appeared to be both emperor and god, mortal and divine. He healed the wounds of Rome with gifts and games, but he also sowed the seeds of something more dangerous, a belief in his own extraordinary nature. To the masses, he was almost superhuman. To Caligula himself, that illusion began to harden into truth. There is a cruelty in illusions. They do not break gently. They shatter, leaving jagged edges that cut deep. For now, though, Rome rested in the warmth of his radiance, blind to the shadows lengthening behind him. The kindness they embraced was not rooted in stability or principle. It was a fevered dream, brilliant but fragile. And as dreams always do, it would eventually dissolve, giving way to the darker reality beneath. For the moment, however, Caligula stood adored, a god among mortals, basking in the applause of a city that had forgotten the weight of fear. Rome celebrated, drank, and slept in the comfort of its illusion, not knowing that the kindness it so cherished was the very stage upon which the madness would soon begin to perform. The months that followed the dawn of Caligula's reign had been gilded with hope. Rome had drunk deeply from the cup of his generosity, cheering as if the city itself had been reborn. But gold, when handled too long, begins to wear thin, and beneath its surface, the metal shows its true nature. The same was happening now. What had once seemed like the hand of a merciful prince began, little by little, to reveal the grip of something far less gentle. It began not with thunder, but with whispers. Small things that could be overlooked at first. A senator summoned to the palace for a friendly supper, only to find himself questioned with a smile that did not quite reach Caligula's eyes. A wealthy knight who discovered his estates had been seized, the explanation vague, the decree sudden. A young man once praised in public found himself banished to an island without warning, his name erased from polite conversation. These events did not disturb the masses. Most were hardly aware of them. To the people, Caligula was still the bright figure who staged games and handed out coins. But within the Senate, and among those who lived closer to the machinery of power, unease began to stir. Cruelty rarely announces itself as cruelty in its first steps. It creeps in quietly, disguised as justice, or as necessity, or as the right of the ruler to act as he pleases. When Caligula mocked a senator in front of others, it was laughed off as youthful wit. When he demanded the fortune of a nobleman, it was excused as the emperor's privilege. When a man disappeared, people whispered he must have offended the gods or carried guilt the rest of Rome did not see. No one dared imagine that these were signs of a mask beginning to slip. Yet patterns grow difficult to ignore. The generosity that had once seemed like rivers flowing through the city began to ebb. Debts were no longer paid so freely. Promises made with a flourish were left unfulfilled. Instead, new spectacles replaced them, louder and stranger than before. The games grew bloodier, the banquets more extravagant, as if Caligula needed greater and greater distractions to feed some hunger that could not be satisfied. At one feast, he is said to have laughed as guests were served food of staggering rarity while he spoke idly of how easily he could ruin them all with a gesture. His tone was light, almost playful, but the words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Some laughed nervously, unsure whether he meant it as jest. Others bowed their heads, not daring to respond. Only Caligula knew if the laughter was genuine or if it was merely fear dressed in politeness. There were rumours too, carried on soft voices in the markets and in the colonnades. Stories of cruelty disguised as entertainment, of prisoners thrown into the arena not for justice but for the amusement of a bored emperor. Tales of executions ordered on whims, of men punished simply because their wealth caught his eye, or their wives their beauty. None of these whispers could be proven, and yet they multiplied, as whispers do, growing more vivid with every retelling. Rome was learning to smile by day, while trembling in silence by night. Among the people, adoration still clung stubbornly to him. He appeared in the streets with his radiant smile, tossing coins, arranging festivals, playing the part of the benevolent ruler. But even the crowds began to sense the unevenness of his gaze, how it lingered too long on some, how it narrowed suddenly, as if measuring hidden offences. Children still adored him, women still swooned, but men grew cautious, watching him as one watches a flame, warming when contained, but dangerous when left unchecked. His family ties too revealed fractures. Caligula, who had once honoured his dead mother and siblings with such tender ceremony, began to turn that same attention into a weapon. He spoke of his sisters with a devotion that unsettled some, blurring lines between honour and obsession. Their names, once celebrated with dignity, were now entwined in rumours of intimacy that proper Romans only whispered about. Whether truth or invention, the mere existence of such whispers revealed how the people had begun to expect strangeness, even darkness, from their emperor. In the palaces, fear grew sharper. Servants learned that silence was the safest companion. They spoke little, looked down when addressed, and never repeated what they saw, for they had seen enough. The feast that had once dazzled them now ended with drunken laughter that curdled into rage, cups hurled against walls, sudden outbursts of suspicion that sent noble guests fleeing with pale faces. Caligula could turn kindness into cruelty in the space of a heartbeat, as though he himself no longer recognized the difference. The Senate, meanwhile, found itself shrinking under his gaze. Men who had once believed themselves restored to dignity now realized they were little more than actors in his theatre. Their decrees mattered only if he approved them, their debates only if he found them amusing. A senator who spoke too boldly discovered that wit could be punished with exile. Another who offered too much flattery found himself mocked instead, as if Caligula delighted in reminding them all that their fates rested on his mood. And yet no one dared resist. The memory of Tiberius still lingered, of his spies, his trials, his sudden executions. Rome had endured terror before, now it endured capriciousness. Which was worse? A storm that punished consistently, or a lightning bolt that struck without warning? The whispers grew louder. They told of a man who found joy in humiliation, who asked fathers to dine with him only to parade their daughters before the court, who demanded treasures from temples and laughed as sacred objects were stripped of gold. They told of a man who began to believe not only in his divine favour, but in his divinity itself, no longer satisfied to stand beside statues of gods, but demanding worship as though he were one. For the moment, Rome still clapped and cheered, but beneath the cheers lay something brittle. It was the applause of an audience that no longer believed entirely in the play, but was too afraid to leave their seats. The kindness that had once charmed them was now shadowed by unease, and the shadow was spreading. The mask of mercy had not yet shattered, but cracks had appeared, and through those cracks the first true glimpse of Caligula's cruelty shone, sharp and merciless, like a blade catching the light. In Rome, the emperor was more than a ruler. He was a figure draped in sacred mystery, touched by the gods, seated between mortal and divine. His family, too, shared in this aura. Sisters and daughters, wives and mothers, were not merely relatives, but emblems of dynastic power, their bodies woven into the very fabric of statecraft. For Caligula, that line between family and empire blurred until it disappeared entirely. Within the walls of the Palatine, affection became possession, and possession turned into rumour, and rumour into something darker still. He had 3 sisters, Agrippina, Julia Drusilla, and then Livilla. To the public they were the jewels of the imperial household, women of beauty and pedigree who carried themselves with dignity before the eyes of Rome. But in the palace, their closeness to Caligula stirred unease. He did not treat them as siblings in the ordinary sense. He seated them beside him at banquets, in positions reserved for consorts. He swore oaths by their names, as though invoking them as sacred powers. He had their likenesses honoured with coins and statues, placing them before the people as figures not merely of kinship, but of reverence. Of the 3, Drusilla stood apart. She was the one he seemed to adore most openly, the one he could not bear to be parted from. When she married, Caligula brought her back into the palace, refusing to allow another man to claim her presence fully. He called her his equal, his companion, the one closest to his soul. Their bond was so public, so insistent, that whispers of incest began to pass from mouth to mouth. Some dismissed them as envy, others as slander. But the gestures he made, the words he spoke, gave those whispers fuel. Roman society was no stranger to scandal, but incest carried a weight all its own. It evoked not only disgust, but fear, for it trespassed into the realm of the gods. In the myths, incest belonged to figures of divine power, Jupiter taking his own sisters as wives, the gods mingling blood with blood. For a mortal to imitate such unions was to claim divinity for himself, to step beyond the human boundary and place himself among the immortals. Whether Caligula believed this consciously, or whether it was instinct, is difficult to say, but his actions suggested a man who saw in his sisters not just family, but extensions of his own authority. Drusilla's death revealed the depth of this strange devotion. When she fell ill and died, Caligula plunged into mourning with a ferocity that startled even those accustomed to the excess of emperors. He ordered the city to grieve with him. Shops closed, courts halted, public life stood still. He declared a period of mourning so intense it seemed the entire empire had lost not merely a sister of the emperor, but a goddess. Drusilla was deified, her image raised among the stars, her name spoken in prayers. Caligula wept openly, not as a brother, but as though he had lost a beloved wife. To some, this was touching, even pitiable. To others, it was proof that the rumours carried truth. Why else would a man mourn with such desperation, unless the bond had crossed the limits of nature? The Senate, uneasy and silent, obeyed his decrees, deifying Drusilla as he demanded. But in the privacy of their halls, they exchanged glances heavy with suspicion. The people, too, muttered quietly. Rome had grown accustomed to emperors breaking norms, but to see the imperial household turned into a theatre of incest struck even the jaded heart of the city with unease. The other sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, did not escape the shadow of these whispers. They too were seen at his side, dressed with honours, treated as partners in rule. Coins bore their images alongside his, a sign of closeness no emperor before him had dared to display so boldly. In this, Caligula was making a statement. His family was not merely kin, but part of his sacred identity. Yet in raising them so high, he also exposed them to danger. For power in Rome was always a double-edged sword. Soon, envy and suspicion wrapped around them. Caligula's possessiveness turned into paranoia. He accused his sisters of betrayal, of plotting against him, of failing in loyalty. Whether these accusations had any foundation mattered little. In his mind, betrayal and incest were two faces of the same intimacy. The closer one stood to him, the greater the risk of falling into either category. Agrippina and Livilla were exiled, cast away from the centre of power. Their honour, once paraded through Rome, was smeared with accusations of adultery and conspiracy. They had once been raised up as symbols of divine closeness, but now they were reduced to prisoners, their fates bound to the unpredictable moods of their brother. This, too, carried echoes of incestuous possessiveness. If he could not have them entirely, no one else would. The empire watched this strange theatre unfold. Some pitied the sisters, others condemned them, but all understood the deeper message. Caligula's court was no longer guided by reason, law, or tradition. It was guided by desire and suspicion, by the whims of a man who saw himself as godlike, and therefore bound by no human boundary. Incest in this context was not only a matter of private scandal, it was a political act. By placing his sisters in roles that blurred the lines between family, consort, and goddess, Caligula was dissolving the distinctions that held Roman society together. In the streets, common people repeated stories with a mix of fascination and horror. Some whispered that Caligula had openly taken Drusilla to his bed, that he had boasted of it as though proud of the scandal. Others claimed he had fathered children by his sisters, children hidden or destroyed to prevent them from threatening his place. These may have been inventions, born of gossip's natural hunger for the outrageous. But the fact that such stories spread so easily showed how readily Rome believed them. They fit the image of a man whose cruelty was now matched by strangeness, whose power bent even the most sacred taboos. The imperial household, once the model of Roman virtue, became instead a stage of decadence and sin. Temples still received sacrifices, festivals still celebrated the gods, but everyone knew that the heart of Rome, the emperor's palace, was a place where the natural order had been overturned. Sisters were treated as wives, wives discarded like servants, loyalty rewarded with ruin, and death disguised as love. For Caligula, incest was not merely a private indulgence. It was an assertion of his absolute power, a way of showing that he was beyond mortal law, that even the most sacred boundaries could be crossed if he willed it. To sleep with his sisters, or even to be rumoured to do so, was to proclaim that he, like Jupiter, stood above the rules of men. It was cruelty of a subtler kind, not of lash and blade, but of example, forcing an empire to watch as its emperor lived like a god, and reminding them that they could do nothing to stop it. And so, within the palace walls, love and horror mingled. Drusilla's name was worshipped as divine, Agrippina and Livilla bore the scars of exile, and Caligula stood at the centre, half brother, half husband, half god. Rome endured it in silence, for what choice did it have? To question too loudly was to risk exile, ruin, or worse. And so the whispers continued, soft and fearful, while the empire carried on, bound to a ruler whose household had become a mirror of his madness. The palace on the Palatine was not merely a residence. It was a world unto itself, a vast labyrinth of colonnades and vaulted ceilings, its marble surfaces gleaming in torchlight long after the rest of Rome had gone to sleep. By day, it carried the solemnity of empire, the thrum of messengers, the shuffle of senators waiting for an audience, the clatter of soldiers at their posts. But by night, its air changed. Curtains were drawn, incense burned, and the vast chambers became theatres of pleasure, echoing with sounds that were never meant for public ears. Caligula's court was a place where appetite dissolved boundaries. The banquets began innocently enough, with golden trays bearing roasted peacocks, haunches of venison glazed in honey, oysters and figs spilling over silver bowls. Wine flowed in streams, poured not into clay, but into vessels of crystal and chalcedony, each goblet heavy with jewels. Guests reclined on couches draped in silks, their bodies sinking into cushions dyed in rare colours stolen from the farthest edges of empire. Yet the food and the wine were only preludes, offerings to loosen tongues and weaken resistance. The night stretched long, and the feast shifted into something stranger. Servants dimmed the lamps until only the glow of braziers lit the walls, shadows trembling across painted gods who watched silently from the plaster. Musicians played in hidden alcoves, soft flutes and distant lyres weaving an atmosphere thick and languid. And then, with the guests half drowned in intoxication, Caligula would rise. He spoke not as host, but as master of the night, declaring what was to follow. The orgies were not private trysts hidden in corners. They were spectacles staged before all, where desire itself became performance. Nobles accustomed to guarding their dignity were pulled into a realm where modesty no longer mattered. Husbands were commanded to give up their wives, wives to embrace strangers, brothers and sisters to blur the lines of kinship under the emperor's gaze. Resistance was impossible. The emperor's whim was law, and to deny him was to risk exile or death. In those marble halls, power and lust entwined so tightly that they became indistinguishable. Caligula took pleasure not merely in indulgence, but in domination, in seeing senators lower themselves before him in ways unthinkable by daylight. He would point to a man's wife across the couches, summon her with a gesture, and take her away as though plucking fruit from a platter. Sometimes he returned her dishevelled, sometimes not at all, and as he laughed, the others laughed too, though the sound was strained, brittle, each forced chuckle hiding the humiliation they dared not speak aloud. The emperor himself moved like an actor in a play he had written. At times he appeared as a lover, at others as a priest of some forbidden cult, conducting rites that mimic sacrifice but ended in ecstasy. He wore crowns of ivy like Dionysus, or veils like a bride, changing roles as though mocking the very idea of identity. In these nights, he was not simply Caligula the ruler. He was desire unchained, authority made flesh. The presence of his sisters lingered even here, their faces lit by the flicker of lamps. Drusilla had gone, her absence leaving a hollow that wine and flesh could never quite fill, yet her memory haunted the gatherings. Agrippina and Livilla, restored for a time, were drawn into the games, unwilling ornaments of his desire. For him, the familial bond was no shield. It was a chain pulling them deeper into the web of scandal. Their unwillingness meant nothing. Their bloodline made them his trophies. But the orgies were not limited to family or court. Caligula opened the doors to actors, gladiators, and courtesans, mingling the lowest and the highest of Rome in one swirling mass. The rigid ladder of Roman society collapsed beneath the weight of his knights. A senator's daughter could find herself lying beside a charioteer. A patrician matron could be commanded to couple with a foreign slave. And all of it was orchestrated by Caligula, who watched with the satisfaction of a playwright watching his play unfold exactly as scripted. The palace walls themselves seemed to drink in these nights. Murals of gods on the ceiling looked down, silent witnesses to acts that blurred the line between sacred and profane. Statues of Jupiter, Apollo and Venus stood in niches, their marble faces catching the light of torches, their cold eyes forever open to the revels. In this setting, every act felt ritualized, as though Rome itself were being rewritten through bodies in motion. The orgies did not always remain confined indoors. At times, Caligula transformed the gardens into living stages. Fountains spilled water, perfumed with myrrh. Flowers carpeted the lawns, and tents of silk sheltered the emperor's chosen companions. There, beneath the stars, the indulgence spread like wildfire, laughter and cries rising into the night sky. Neighbours across the Palatine claimed they could hear the echoes long after midnight, carried on the wind like the voice of some unholy festival. What unsettled many was not merely the indulgence itself, but the way Caligula seemed to delight in exposure. Other emperors kept their vices hidden, draping scandal in secrecy. He flaunted his. He wanted Rome to know. He paraded lovers in public, spoke openly of his conquests, mocked the fidelity of husbands before their faces. It was as though secrecy diminished the pleasure. Only by letting the world know could his dominance be complete. In these orgies, cruelty was never far from reach. A senator humiliated before his peers carried the shame forever. A wife forced into another's arms returned to her home marked not only in body, but in spirit. Sometimes the pleasure tipped into violence. Caligula, drunk and restless, would order a beating or a sudden execution in the midst of the revel. Blood spilled on marble mingled with wine, and the laughter of moments before froze into silence, only to resume again under his command. For the city outside, these stories leaked in fragments. Servants whispered, dismissed guests carried rumours into the taverns, and soon the people of Rome spoke of their emperor as a figure both fascinating and monstrous. They pictured the halls of the palace as dens of sin where senators crawled like slaves, where noble women shed dignity as easily as silk. The truth may have been tangled with exaggeration, but the image was enough. Rome's ruler was no longer the guardian of tradition, but its violator. And yet there was a strange allure to it all. The very scandal that horrified also fascinated. For some, Caligula's nights seemed like glimpses into the world of gods, where rules did not apply and every desire found expression. For others, they were omens of decay, signs that the empire itself was sliding into corruption. But no one could look away. The orgies in the marble halls were more than indulgence. They were performances of power. Each act reinforced the message that the emperor stood above them all, beyond shame, beyond morality, beyond the limits that bound other men. In making the noble and the base alike submit to his will, he reasserted his position as both ruler and master of their very bodies. And so the night stretched on, one after another, torchlight flickering against polished stone, music drifting through the corridors, the air thick with wine, sweat, and perfume. To those within, it was a dream they could not escape. To those without, it was a nightmare they could not stop imagining. Rome carried on by daylight, its markets bustling, its temples thrumming with prayer. But all the while, the palace loomed above, filled with echoes of nights that seemed to belong less to men than to gods, or to monsters. The marble halls that once throbbed with feasts and whispered laughter gave way to a different kind of theatre, one where silk and perfume were replaced by dust, iron, and the smell of blood. Rome, in all its grandeur, had always thrived on spectacle. Gladiators fought not merely to entertain, but to remind the people of their empire's strength, its dominance over life and death. Yet under Caligula, the games took on a darker edge. They were not simply contests. They were expressions of a mind untethered, a ruler who wielded mortality like a plaything. In the amphitheatres, the day began as it always had. Crowds swarmed in, clutching figs and olives, their voices rising like a tide. The sun blazed overhead, gilding the stone tiers with heat, while the sand below waited, blank and innocent, until the first drop of blood would christen it. To the ordinary Roman, the games were an escape, an eruption of violence that carried their imaginations far from the burdens of daily life. To Caligula, they were something else entirely. He sat not as a patron of sport, but as a god surveying his altar. The emperor delighted in the suddenness of cruelty. Gladiators who fought with skill and courage were sometimes spared, as tradition allowed, but at other times Caligula turned mercy into mockery. A fighter who had earned his reprieve might glance upward, awaiting the familiar thumbs, only to see Caligula signal death instead, his smile broad, his eyes alight with mischief. In those moments, the emperor's will outweighed courage, outweighed fate itself. The arena was no longer about contest, it was about the whim of one man. The boundaries of spectacle stretched wider. Caligula ordered beasts imported from Africa, lions, leopards, elephants, to fight against men chained and weaponless. The crowd roared as teeth tore flesh, as bones racked beneath paws. Yet while the people's appetite for violence was fed, it was Caligula's appetite for invention that unsettled most. He staged battles not merely for victory, but for humiliation. Entire groups of prisoners were herded into the sand, dressed in costumes of gods and heroes, only to be slaughtered in grotesque parodies of myth. It was said he once commanded a reenactment of the story of Icarus. A condemned man was strapped into wings of wax and feathers, raised high above the amphitheatre, and hurled downward. He fell, flailing, the wings tearing loose as he struck the ground to the laughter of the emperor. In another spectacle, he ordered men dressed as satyrs to be torn apart by wild dogs, turning the stage of Dionysian revelry into a grotesque mirror of his nighttime orgies. What horrified those who watched was not only the deaths themselves, but the casualness with which Caligula dispensed them. For him, death was not punishment, nor even entertainment. It was art, a canvas on which he painted his madness. He savoured the crowd's gasps, their nervous laughter, the silence that followed each command, to hold thousands in suspense with a gesture, to determine whether a man would live or die with the flick of a finger, was to taste divinity itself. At times, the emperor turned the arena into his private stage. He appeared dressed as a gladiator, not to fight in earnest, but to parade his body before the people, as though even the armour of Rome's blood-soaked champions was just another costume for him to wear. He mocked the warriors who had trained for years, forcing them to spar with him, only to end the match when it suited him, basking in applause demanded rather than earned. For the senators, the games were a torment. Summoned to sit in the imperial box, they watched as their emperor blurred the line between ruler and executioner, their own dignity held hostage by his madness. Sometimes Caligula turned his gaze upon them directly, ordering nobles into the arena to fight like common criminals. Resistance was impossible. A senator who stumbled in the sand, sword trembling in untrained hands, was a sight that burned humiliation deep into the heart of Rome's political class. Even the innocent were not spared. Caligula found amusement in punishing the smallest offences with the largest of stages. Spectators whispered that he once ordered an entire section of the audience to be thrown into the arena for failing to cheer with sufficient enthusiasm. Whether truth or rumour, the story spread like wildfire, a symbol of his capricious cruelty. At any moment, anyone could become part of the show. The games bled into the city itself. Execution was no longer confined to the amphitheatre. Prisoners were marched through the streets, displayed as though they were trophies, their deaths delayed until Caligula decided their manner of end. Public fountains ran red, the smell of iron lingering in the air long after the spectacle had moved on. Rome itself began to feel like a stage, every corner a potential site of punishment. And yet, the people came. They filled the seats. They shouted and cheered, because in Rome, blood was a currency as familiar as coin. They knew their emperor was mad, but they also knew he gave them what they craved. Bread and games, even twisted by cruelty, still bound the city together. Fear and fascination blended, keeping the masses in their place, while Caligula's shadow grew ever darker. Within the palace, the echoes of the arena never truly faded. At night, when torches flickered against marble walls, the laughter of the day's executions clung to the air. Servants whispered of the emperor pacing, restless, dreaming of new forms of spectacle. He was not content with repetition. Each game had to outdo the last, each death a fresh invention. To him, life was too cheap to waste on predictability. There were whispers, too, of how Caligula blurred the line between performance and reality. During feasts, he would summon gladiators to fight in the banquet halls, blood soaking the mosaic floors as guests tried to eat without trembling. At other times, he commanded musicians to play while men were executed in the background, as though art and death were threads in the same tapestry. No space was sacred, no moment safe from intrusion by his hunger for spectacle. The madness revealed itself most clearly in the way he looked at death, not as an end, but as a toy. He lingered over executions, watched the light fade from men's eyes with the curiosity of a child pulling apart an insect. He mocked the dying, turning their final gasps into jokes, their last moments into lessons for the living. His cruelty was not the cruelty of necessity, but of indulgence, born not from the demands of empire, but from the cravings of a mind untethered. And yet beneath the horror, there was a pattern. The games of blood and death were not random eruptions, but tools. By forcing Rome to witness his madness, Caligula carved himself into their memory as something beyond human. He wanted them to fear, yes, but also to believe he stood outside their world entirely, closer to the gods, or the monsters, than to men. The amphitheatre became a temple where he played priest and deity both, offering sacrifice not to Jupiter or Mars, but to his own insatiable will. Each death was an offering, each cheer a prayer, each silence a confession of helplessness. The empire itself bent beneath the weight of his madness, its traditions warped, its dignity stained with blood. As the sun set on another day of spectacle, the sand of the arena lay heavy with bodies, the air heavy with the stench of iron and sweat. The crowd dispersed, their voices hoarse, their minds filled with images they could not forget. And in his box above, Caligula reclined, satisfied, his eyes already searching for what new invention tomorrow might bring. For Rome, the games had always been a reminder of power. Under Caligula, they became something else, a mirror held up to madness, reflecting an emperor who turned blood into theatre and death into art. And the city, unwilling or unable to look away, found itself an audience trapped in a performance without end. The sand of the arena, still damp with blood, was swept clean by slaves before dawn. Yet while the crowd carried home visions of death and dust, another theatre stirred awake inside the walls of the imperial palace. Here, cruelty wore a different mask. No lions leapt, no swords clashed, but the game was just as merciless. If the amphitheatre was where Caligula broke bodies, the treasury was where he broke fortunes. Gold had always been the lifeblood of empire, flowing in from provinces, from conquests, from the sweat of slaves who dug in the dark. For generations, emperors had balanced its use with caution, careful to maintain the illusion of Rome's stability. But Caligula was no steward. He was a consumer, devouring coin as he devoured lives, seeing wealth not as a resource to preserve, but as a substance to gorge upon. At first, the riches of his inheritance seemed endless. The coffers Augustus had filled, the careful savings of Tiberius, all lay at the disposal of the young emperor. Marble projects, extravagant feasts, ships with gilded hulls, the endless tides of orgies and games, all drained that reservoir, like a wound that would not close. Soon the weight of excess grew heavier than even Rome's vast stores could bear. But Caligula was not a man to curb appetite. When gold ran thin, he did not retreat. He reached outward with the same hunger that filled the arenas, finding in greed another stage on which to play. The senators felt it first. Summoned to the palace under the guise of favour, they found themselves stripped not of dignity this time, but of wealth. Caligula smiled as he reminded them of the empire's needs, of the burdens of loyalty. Refusal was unthinkable. To hesitate was to risk being thrown into the sand, or worse, to vanish quietly into the depths of the prison cells. Their estates shrank overnight, their villas sold to the treasury at prices dictated by the emperor himself. He turned their wealth into his own, draining the lifeblood of Rome's nobility under the name of necessity. Yet it was not only the elite who felt the grasp of his fingers. Merchants, bankers, and moneylenders, those who had long fattened themselves on Rome's expansion, became his prey. He declared sudden debts to the state, fabricated charges of fraud, accused men of withholding taxes long paid. Records were altered, testimonies extracted under torture. What had been their fortune in the morning was Caligula's purse by nightfall. The emperor's coffers swelled with the ruin of men who once believed themselves untouchable. And still, it was not enough. The empire became a field for extortion. From distant provinces came orders of tribute, heavier than before, demanded in gold, grain, and slaves. Governors scrambled to meet impossible quotas, stripping the people beneath them to the bone. Farmers who once tithed a portion of their harvest now found themselves unable to keep seed for the following year. Families who had scraped by for generations were driven into ruin. The empire's edges, once bound by loyalty, began to tremble with resentment, but Caligula's hunger was blind to such cracks. In Rome itself, he devised new forms of greed disguised as spectacle. At banquets, he scattered coins among the floor, not for generosity but for sport, watching nobles scramble like beggars on hands and knees, clawing at the gold while he laughed. Other times he auctioned off the property of condemned men, with himself as auctioneer, his voice rich with mockery, as he named prices no one dared refuse. The possessions of the dead, the wealth of the disgraced, all funneled into the treasury of terror he built around himself. Even the most sacred institutions were not spared. Temples, their treasuries fat with centuries of offerings, became targets. Caligula stripped the gold from statues of gods, melted down ornaments from shrines, even ordered the precious offerings of pilgrims seized. The gods, he said, required no riches, for he himself was now divine. In the quiet of sanctuaries, where prayers once rose, silence lingered, broken only by the sound of coin being carted away under imperial guard. But perhaps the most grotesque invention of his greed was the brothel of the palace. Where emperors before had hidden their vices behind veils of discretion, Caligula turned lust into industry. He transformed chambers of the imperial home into a marketplace of flesh, where senators' wives, noble daughters, and the unwilling alike were paraded for his profit. Patrons were charged ruinous sums to enter, and the money flowed straight into the emperor's treasury. The shame was double-edged, the nobility humiliated, the city robbed, and Caligula enriched by both. The people, once distracted by bread and games, now felt the pressure. New taxes sprouted like weeds: levies on lawsuits, tolls on roads, duties on marriages, even charges on prostitution. Every transaction of daily life became a coin for the emperor. No act was too small, no breath too humble to escape his grasp. Rome groaned beneath the weight, yet the machine ground on, fueled by the emperor's insatiable need. And yet, for all this, Caligula seemed never satisfied. Gold was not wealth in his eyes, but fuel, burned as quickly as it was seized. Ships gleamed with gilded prows, banquets overflowed with delicacies carried from the farthest provinces. Palaces shimmered with marble veined in colours never before seen in Rome. He built bridges of boats across bays, covered their decks with sand, and rowed across them as though defying the sea itself. Each display swallowed mountains of coin, yet brought him only fleeting joy. In private, he played with his treasure like a child with toys. He walked barefoot across piles of coin, letting the metal bite into his skin. He ordered pearls dissolved in vinegar, drinking them as though consuming the wealth of the empire in a single swallow. At times he poured heaps of gold onto the floor, only to roll in it, laughing as though he could merge body and fortune into one. To those who watched, it was both absurd and terrifying. An emperor who treated the wealth of the world not as resource, but as sand in his hourglass, to be scattered on a whim. Those who resisted him found their end swift and cruel. Men accused of hoarding wealth were executed publicly, their estates seized. Families of the condemned were left destitute, their names erased from public honour. To cross Caligula's hunger was to invite annihilation, for he tolerated no obstacle between himself and his gold. Yet beneath the glitter of coin lay rot. The empire's veins strained, its provinces bleeding under extortion, its people bent beneath the weight of taxation. Trade faltered, trust decayed, and whispers spread through the markets of Rome. The emperor's madness had once been spectacle, a thing to gape at in horror and fascination. Now it was hunger, gnawing at the very foundations of the state. Still, Caligula did not relent. To him, the treasury was not a place to safeguard wealth, but a vault for fear. Each coin that clinked into his coffers was another thread binding Rome to his will. Gold was power, and in his hands it became a weapon as sharp as any sword, as final as any death sentence. And so the empire endured, drained and trembling, as its emperor surrounded himself with a fortune built not of stewardship, but of terror. The treasury swelled with stolen lives, with blood turned into coin, with the ashes of faith and dignity. And at its centre sat Caligula, a man who turned greed into theatre, wealth into cruelty, and the empire's gold into the mirror of his madness. Gold flowed into the palace like a poisoned river, filling vaults carved into stone, clinking in the torch's glow. But wealth was never enough for Caligula. Coins could be melted, jewels crushed, temples stripped bare. What remained, what resisted his hunger, was power itself, the dignity of men who had long believed themselves guardians of Rome. Senators, cloaked in purple, spoke of tradition and law, their marble halls echoing with debate. For centuries, emperors had balanced their authority with deference, at least in appearance, preserving the fiction that Rome still belonged to its Senate. Caligula despised the fiction. To him, the Senate was not a partner in rule, but a theatre of weakness. Their gestures of dignity amused him. Their speeches were wind. Their loyalty was survival disguised as honour. He did not wish merely to control them. He wished to unmake them, to grind their pride into the dust and force them to wear shame like a toga. It began with words. In the vast chamber of the Curia, where once Cicero's voice had thundered, Caligula laughed. He mocked the trembling senators, called them slaves, called them women, called them nothing. He demanded they kiss his feet, demanded they wait upon him at banquets like servants, demanded that men who traced their lineage back to the Republic's founding fathers bow before him as though he were Jupiter himself. And they did, for the alternative was ruin, exile, or death. The chamber that had once carried the weight of empire's decisions now echoed with the sound of sycophancy. But cruelty thrives not in words alone, and mockery needs spectacle to truly wound. It was in this spirit that Caligula turned his gaze toward the most absurd symbol of all, a horse. Incitatus, sleek and strong, was no ordinary animal. Adorned in marble stables, fed oats mixed with gold flakes, the beast dined finer than many senators. Its collar gleamed with jewels, its bed draped in purple. Slaves tended it with reverence, not as a horse, but as a prince. To Caligula, the animal was not just a companion, it was a weapon, a living insult sharpened against the pride of the Senate. Rumours spread quickly. The emperor planned to make Incitatus a consul, to grant the creature a seat in the marble halls where men argued over Rome's fate. The idea was grotesque, but under Caligula, grotesque often became real. Senators dared not laugh, for laughter could be treason. They dared not protest, for protest was a death sentence. So they bowed their heads while the emperor whispered of his horse's future power, as though daring them to deny him. At feasts, he seated Incitatus beside him, goblet of wine raised to the animal's lips. He toasted to the horse's wisdom, praised its silence as greater than the babble of the Senate. Guests, forced to smile, clinked their cups in trembling hands while Caligula's laughter filled the chamber. The insult was not subtle. By elevating a beast to their rank, he told the senators they were beneath even an animal. Their office once sacred, was now a toy. The palace became a carnival of humiliation. Senators were compelled to race beside the horse in public, stumbling in their robes as the animal pranced. They were ordered to host banquets in Incitatus's honour, their tables groaning under the weight of delicacies no man could eat, but a horse would trample. Some whispered that the emperor did not intend merely to jest, that he truly desired to place the beast in consul's robes, to carve its name upon official documents, to etch into stone the final mockery of the Republic's corpse. Whether true or not, the threat itself was enough to break the Senate's spirit. But Caligula's contempt reached deeper than games. He forced senators to prosecute absurd trials, accusing them of crimes invented in his imagination. Men who once judged others now stood accused of treason for failing to worship his divinity properly, or for neglecting to sacrifice at his altars, or for failing to smile broadly enough at his jokes. Their punishments were ruinous. Estates seized, wives disgraced, children enslaved. Others were executed publicly, their blood soaking into the steps of temples that once symbolized Rome's law. At times, Caligula reversed the roles entirely. He summoned senators to preside over trials of animals, demanding they debate the guilt of the dogs, horses, or goats accused of imaginary offences. To object was to risk their own necks, so the men of Rome, once lawmakers and generals, now argued solemnly over the supposed treachery of beasts. It was not law, it was theatre, and Caligula its cruel director. The degradation seeped into daily life. Senators were ordered to serve as gladiators in mock combats, fighting clumsily in the arena while crowds jeered. Others were commanded to run beside the emperor's chariot, their senatorial shoes slipping on the stones as they stumbled to keep pace. Their purple-bordered robes, once a symbol of office, now dragged in the dust, torn and filthy, while Caligula's laughter split the air. Yet even humiliation was not enough. Caligula longed for their terror, for the tightening of throats, the sweating of brows, the hollow eyes of men forced to live in constant dread. At banquets he kept senators seated, while he whispered with soldiers behind them, staging false conspiracies only to laugh when the men turned pale. Other times he paused mid-feast to order sudden arrests, dragging away guests into the night. The survivors would return the next day to find their colleague's seat empty, as though erased by the sweep of his hand. The Senate chamber itself grew into a mausoleum of fear. Men spoke less and less, their voices fading into silence. When Caligula entered, all eyes fixed upon him, not as ruler, but as predator. He did not need to pass laws or issue decrees. His presence was enough to govern, for fear had become the only legislation. In this world of dread, Incitatus shone brighter than any senator. Fed from golden bowls, guarded by soldiers, lulled to sleep in silence, enforced by edict, the horse became a grotesque mirror of the Senate's decline. A beast enjoyed the luxuries once reserved for Rome's ruling class, while the men themselves scraped and bowed like slaves. Whether Caligula ever truly intended to crown the animal consul mattered little. The damage was done. The Senate's dignity was shattered, its authority mocked, its existence reduced to farce. And still, the emperor's cruelty pressed on. What began as insult grew into annihilation. Senators were executed not for crimes but for amusement, their deaths punctuating his feasts. Their names, their legacies, their families, obliterated with the stroke of his pen. Rome's governing body, once the engine of empire, now served as little more than a stage upon which Caligula performed his theatre of madness. In the end, it was not the horse that entered the Curia, but the shadow of its hooves. Incitatus remained in marble stables, pampered and absurd, while senators crept through corridors haunted by the laughter of their emperor. The symbol was enough. Rome understood. Its rulers were no longer men of reason. but puppets at the whim of a tyrant who saw no difference between beast and statesman. And so the empire staggered forward, its treasury drained, its senate disgraced, its dignity trampled under the hooves of a horse that never needed to speak. For in Caligula's Rome, silence was the loudest truth of all. The laughter that once filled the Senate's halls did not remain confined within marble walls. It spilled outward, carried on the breath of an emperor who treated the world itself as his stage. Rome had long been a city of triumphs. Parades of soldiers returning from distant conquests, their armour shining beneath banners, their captives and treasures paraded through the streets to remind the people of empire's glory. Victory was the blood of Roman identity, and emperors drew legitimacy from the dust of battlefields. But Caligula, whose cruelty had already twisted the dignity of the Senate into a spectacle, sought not glory in conquest, but theatre in absurdity. The armies of Rome, hardened by campaigns in Gaul and Germania, men who had marched across rivers and forests, now found themselves marching not against tribes or kings, but against the sea itself. For Caligula had declared war on Neptune, the god of waters, the vast and restless ocean that lay beyond Rome's shores. The emperor claimed the god had offended him, that the sea had withheld its obedience, that its waves mocked his power. And so the legions, who once shattered kingdoms, received their orders to march against an enemy without flesh or blood. They advanced toward the coast in disciplined ranks, spears glittering, shields raised, banners snapping in the salt wind. Villages along the way watched in confusion as the mighty army, instead of pressing deeper into foreign lands, halted at the water's edge. There, with the sea stretching endless before them, Caligula ordered battle formations, trumpets blared, centurions barked commands, and the soldiers, trained to face flesh and steel, now faced rolling waves. The order came. With swords unsheathed, they charged. Feet pounded against wet sand, armour clattered, voices roared. The waves, indifferent, surged forward, crashed against their legs, foamed around their knees, and retreated as if mocking the assault. Still they struck, blades slashing at the surf, spears thrust into the water. Shields lifted against spray as though against arrows. A battle raged without enemy. A war fought against nothing but the endless pulse of tides. Caligula stood upon a raised platform, cloaked in purple, laurel crown gleaming, watching the chaos below. To him, this was triumph, the emperor commanding not men, but nature itself. When the waves did not bow, he demanded trophies. Soldiers bent down, scooping shells from the sand, gathering them as though they were plunder wrested from Neptune's domain. Each handful of shells became, in Caligula's decree, the spoils of a conquered sea. The legionaries, bewildered but obedient, filled their helmets, their packs, their cloaks, burdened with fragments of shore, as though carrying the treasures of a fallen city. But shells alone were not enough. Caligula ordered chains to be thrown into the surf, great lengths of iron, dragged by straining men, cast into the water as though to bind the ocean itself. The spectacle was absurd, yet deadly serious. To defy the emperor was to court death, and so the legions obeyed, their sweat mixing with salt as they heaved useless chains into the tide. Caligula declared the waters shackled, Neptune defeated, Rome victorious. When the battle ended, he staged a triumph as if he had crushed a foreign power. Roads were lined, trumpets resounded, soldiers marched through towns with their helmets brimming with shells. Standards fluttered, inscriptions announced victory over the sea. Citizens watched in silence, uncertain whether to cheer or tremble, for who could deny the emperor's truth when denial meant ruin? Rome had celebrated victories over Carthage, over Gaul, over Parthia. Now it celebrated victory over water. To the Senate, The triumph was another insult. These were men who had presided over real wars, who had debated matters of state while armies bled in Germania or Dacia. Now they were summoned to applaud a conquest of waves. Caligula paraded before them the spoils of his campaign, nets filled with shells, jars of seawater, stones from the beach. He commanded them to record the victory in Rome's annals, to enshrine in history the emperor's conquest of Neptune. Their pens scratched reluctantly across parchment, binding absurdity into permanence, their shame deepening with every stroke. And yet, beneath the ridicule, there lay a chilling truth. Caligula's war on the sea was not merely madness, it was power displayed in its most terrifying form. By compelling Rome's legions, the pride of the empire, to fight waves, he proved that obedience to him had no limit. Soldiers who would have died gladly against Germanic warriors now killed time in mock battles with foam, their valour wasted, but their loyalty unquestioned. The Senate, humiliated by horse and shell alike, bent ever lower, their dignity drowned in laughter. Still, Caligula's imagination did not rest. The coast became his playground, the sea his adversary, the soldiers his actors. He ordered the construction of temporary piers stretching into the water, where banquets were staged above the tide. He dined upon the surf, proclaiming himself master of land and sea alike, Neptune's equal, Jupiter's son. Boats were lashed together to form floating palaces, where orgies unfolded beneath fluttering banners, while waves lapped at the sides. Soldiers and slaves, exhausted, strained to keep the unstable platform steady, while the emperor revelled, oblivious to their struggle. The mockery extended beyond Rome's shores. Messages were sent to distant provinces, announcing the emperor's great naval victory. Coins were minted, bearing his image crowned with laurel, inscriptions proclaiming triumph over Neptune. In marketplaces and taverns, whispers spread, half fearful, half amused. Some mocked him in private, but always with eyes darting toward shadows, for spies were everywhere. Others believed his madness divine, that if Caligula said the sea was conquered, then perhaps it truly was. For Rome, accustomed to rulers cloaking ambition with reason, the absurdity was dizzying. Yet in absurdity lay danger. Caligula's war against the sea revealed not weakness, but the terrifying strength of one who could bend reality itself. If soldiers could be made to stab at waves, if senators could be made to honour a horse, then what limit remained? His power was no longer rooted in law, nor even in violence alone, but in the annihilation of reason. To resist him was not merely to risk death. It was to stand against a world where truth itself was dictated by his whim. The beaches, once scarred by footprints of legions charging into surf, grew silent again. Shells lay scattered where soldiers had once gathered them like treasure. Chains rusted where they had been dragged into the tide. But the memory lingered. A phantom of absurdity pressed into Rome's soul. The sea rolled on, indifferent, unbound, eternal. The soldiers returned inland, their silence heavier than their armour, their triumph hollow, their loyalty tested not by the enemy's blade, but by the emperor's madness. And so the empire marched forward, carrying in its annals a victory that was no victory at all, a conquest that mocked the very notion of conquest. Rome's greatness, once forged in blood and stone, now found itself shackled to the whims of a man who declared himself master of the impossible. The tide continued its rhythm, waves rising and falling, each one a reminder that some powers could not be chained, not even by emperors crowned with laurel. Yet Caligula smiled, certain that he had humbled Neptune, certain that Rome itself bent with the sea to his will. And in that smile, the empire saw its reflection. Not triumph, not glory, but madness dressed as majesty. The waves had long since receded, leaving only the sound of surf and the echo of laughter that no one dared call madness. Soldiers returned to Rome with helmets heavy not from plunder but from shells, their triumph hollow, yet proclaimed as divine. And as the city absorbed this performance, the air began to change. What had once been amusement, whispered mockery shared in taverns, began to twist into something darker. For the emperor who had chained the sea was no longer satisfied with humiliating senators or mocking the gods. His stage was now the streets themselves, and his actors the people of Rome. At first Rome had welcomed him. He was the boy emperor, the child of beloved Germanicus, heir to a lineage that carried the scent of glory. Crowds once cheered his name as if salvation itself had descended upon them after years of suspicion and blood. His early reign was filled with hope, coins minted with his youthful face, statues rising in his honour, voices lifted in prayer for his health. But the tide that once bore him upward had turned, and the people now looked upon that same face and saw not salvation, but something that stalked them even in dreams. Fear crept slowly at first. Executions became spectacles, not of justice, but of theatre. Men and women summoned to banquets were never certain if they would return. Caligula enjoyed the suspense, stretching silence at the table before gesturing toward an unfortunate guest, condemning him with nothing more than a flick of his hand. Sometimes he had them dragged away immediately. Other times he let them sit through the entire feast, eating and drinking under the shadow of their sentence, knowing death waited just beyond the doorway. In the markets, whispers travelled faster than grain. A merchant who once spoke proudly of Germanicus's son now lowered his voice when uttering the emperor's name. Stories multiplied. A senator forced to watch his child executed before being slain himself. Nobles stripped of fortunes to feed Caligula's endless games. A man punished simply for dreaming that the emperor would fall. The line between rumour and truth blurred, for Caligula thrived on uncertainty. When fear is everywhere, even lies become weapons. The city itself became his playground. At night, Caligula was said to roam the streets in disguise, cloaked and hooded, mingling with commoners only to strike them down in sudden fits of violence. Others claimed he sent his guards to seize strangers at random, vanishing them into prisons from which no one returned. Each shadow became suspect, each footstep in the dark a reminder that the emperor's eyes were never far away. Rome, once the heart of empire, grew tense beneath the weight of silence. Where once laughter and music spilled from taverns, now conversations halted at the sound of approaching boots. Families shuttered windows earlier, doors bolted tight against a world that had turned unpredictable. The emperor's image hung everywhere, on statues, on coins, on banners fluttering above the forum, and yet the people trembled at the thought of his gaze. The theatre of cruelty extended to the circus and the amphitheatre. Caligula, seated in gleaming splendour, delighted not in the skill of charioteers or the valour of gladiators, but in the agony of the condemned. He demanded executions be prolonged, inventive in their horror, as though cruelty itself was the true sport. Prisoners were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or forced to fight wild beasts unarmed, while the emperor's laughter cut sharper than the claws of lions. Children were not spared from the spectacle. Entire families could be dragged into the sand, condemned together for imagined crimes. For those in power, survival meant humiliation. Senators, once Rome's proudest voices, cowered before him, forced to compete in absurd displays of loyalty. Some kissed his feet in public, others lavished him with gifts they could scarcely afford, all praying that their gestures might delay the inevitable. Yet submission did not guarantee safety. Indeed, it often invited sharper cruelty. Caligula seemed to revel in the sight of once proud men stripped of dignity, their faces pale with terror, their voices trembling as they pledged loyalty to a ruler who mocked them openly. Even the common people, once his greatest supporters, began to feel his hand upon their throats. Taxes climbed, festivals grew more extravagant at their expense. Grain shipments were diverted to feed his personal amusements. The emperor's hunger for gold seemed bottomless. He demanded contributions for temples in his honour, for statues of himself towering above Rome, for games that stretched for days while citizens went hungry. Those who complained too loudly vanished, their silence absorbed into the growing hush that blanketed the streets. And through it all, Caligula presented himself as divine. He did not merely wish to be emperor, he wished to be worshipped. Temples were erected not for Jupiter or Mars, but for himself. Statues of the gods were stripped of their heads, replaced with his own likeness. Priests once devoted to ancient rites now bent their prayers toward him, their chants hollow but necessary. In Rome's great temples, incense rose not to the heavens, but to a man who demanded the devotion of eternity. To the people, this blasphemy deepened their unease. Rome was no stranger to emperors claiming divine favour, but Caligula demanded divinity itself. He walked through sacred halls in golden robes, declaring himself Jupiter incarnate. He appeared in the dress of Venus, draped in silks, painted and jewelled, blurring the boundaries between man, God, and mockery. Some whispered in fear that he truly had become more than mortal, that the madness in his eyes was not sickness, but something supernatural. Others clenched their fists in secret, knowing only that Rome had become hostage to a man untethered from reason. As months turned to years, the weight of fear thickened. The city's pulse slowed, its streets carrying not the confident stride of empire, but the cautious shuffle of survival. Friends became cautious in each other's presence, unsure who might repeat a careless word. Families taught their children silence, warning them never to speak of the emperor except in praise. Even the soldiers who once adored him grew restless, their pride dulled by mock campaigns and endless humiliations. Yet loyalty held, for fear bound tighter than love. And still Caligula pressed further. He drained the treasury for his spectacles, then demanded offerings from the wealthy, seizing estates and treasures under the guise of imperial need. Rome's finest homes were stripped bare, their contents paraded as gifts for the emperor. Women of noble birth were summoned to his bed without protest, their families powerless to object. He took what he pleased, when he pleased his desire law, his whims unchallenged. It was said the people began to look away when his processions passed, unwilling to meet the gaze of the man who had once seemed their protector. Cheers gave way to silence, silence to dread. And dread, if left too long, begins to curdle into hatred. The fear in the streets was no longer simply fear of death. It was fear of living under a shadow, where every dawn might bring another cruelty, where the ruler of Rome had become a predator moving among his flock. Each day stretched longer than the last, a city holding its breath, waiting for the knife that might fall from any direction. And yet, even in silence, Rome endured. The markets still bustled, the aqueducts still flowed, the forum still hummed with business. Life did not stop, but it bent. It bent beneath the weight of fear, reshaped itself around the madness of a man who believed himself immortal. And in that bending, the empire itself began to strain, cracks forming in marble and memory alike. For though fear could silence voices, it could not erase thought. And beneath the stillness of Rome's streets, behind shuttered windows and locked doors, the seeds of something dangerous were beginning to stir. Rome had grown accustomed to silence, but silence is never empty. Beneath the hush of fearful streets, beneath the prayers whispered to an emperor who called himself a god, something began to stir. Not loudly, not openly, only in murmurs behind closed doors, in glances exchanged between men who dared not speak too long, in letters burned before dawn. Fear had ruled the city for too long, and fear has a strange way of turning upon its master. The city's marble walls had witnessed such moments before. From Caesar's fall to the paranoia of Tiberius, Rome had always been a place where power walked on shifting ground. Yet under Caligula, the danger no longer moved subtly. His excesses filled every corner of life, draining wealth, humiliating senators, consuming the dignity of soldiers and citizens alike. It was not merely cruelty that pushed Rome to the edge, it was the suffocating certainty that cruelty would never end. Among the Praetorian Guard, unease spread. These were men sworn to protect the emperor, his personal shield against the dangers of the world. Yet they had also seen his face up close, had heard the laughter that accompanied executions, had been forced to play roles in his theatre of fear. Their loyalty had once been secure, for loyalty was rewarded with gold, with food, with status. But the coffers were thinning, and promises began to taste like lies. A guard may endure hardship for a cause, but when hardship comes only for the amusement of one man, endurance begins to fray. The senators, stripped of authority and forced into humiliations, nursed their bitterness in silence. Each feast where they bowed low, each decree they applauded with trembling hands, added weight to their resentment. They spoke carefully, often not at all, but their eyes told the truth. Behind their polished words of loyalty, there was only calculation. Who might survive if fortune shifted? Who might seize the moment if it came? And among the emperor's own household, the air thickened with dread. Family ties had long been severed by suspicion, cousins and uncles executed, sisters paraded as ornaments or victims. No bond remained sacred. Those closest to him knew that intimacy with Caligula meant little more than proximity to danger. Each day survived was counted as luck, not privilege. Even blood could not soften his cruelty. The people too, though powerless, added their part. Their silence was not simply submission, it was watchfulness. Rome's streets were lined with eyes that saw every cruelty, ears that heard every rumour, hearts that remembered every humiliation. A city can tolerate much, but it does not forget. And so, without a single meeting, without a single oath, the threads of conspiracy began to weave themselves. It was not a single plan, not one clear scheme. It was a gathering of resentments, a collection of men and women who found their hatred heavy enough to demand action. They were not united by trust. Trust was too dangerous under such a ruler. They were united only by necessity. The whispers moved most easily among the guards. They were the ones who stood closest to the emperor, the ones who held swords within reach of his life. They were also the ones most humiliated. Caligula had mocked them openly, calling them cowards, stripping them of honours, demanding they perform duties beneath their station. To serve him was no longer a mark of pride, it was a mark of degradation. Some began to imagine what might follow if their service ended. In the Senate, the conversations were cloaked in poetry, in metaphor, in the language of old tales. A man might speak of Brutus and Cassius, of tyrants overthrown for the good of the Republic, his words disguised as academic reflection. Another might respond with a story of the gods punishing hubris. On the surface, harmless. Beneath, dangerous. Each nod, each pause carried weight. but the palace itself was perhaps the most treacherous ground. Servants saw what others did not: Caligula's private rages, his sudden cruelties, his indulgences that stretched into delirium. A slave who poured his wine might vanish the next day. A guard who misstepped in ritual was punished as though guilty of treason. Those who survived learned the value of silence, but silence breeds resentment, and resentment, when shared, becomes conspiracy. The emperor sensed it. His paranoia, already sharp, deepened. He accused men of plotting without evidence, executed them before rumours could become actions. He surrounded himself with spies, demanded loyalty oaths, staged sudden purges. Yet each death only widened the circle of enemies. For every senator executed, 2 more sons or brothers or allies inherited his hatred. For every guard dismissed or punished, comrades watched and wondered when their turn might come. The empire itself seemed to hold its breath. Provinces sent reports of unrest. Generals grumbled over resources drained to fund Rome's endless spectacles. Grain shipments wavered. Wealth flowed into the emperor's pockets while roads crumbled and soldiers went unpaid. What began as whispers in Rome became murmurs in the provinces, a quiet but growing recognition that the centre of empire was faltering under the weight of one man's madness. And so, the shadows grew thicker. Senators walked with care, but behind their caution lay intent. Guards carried their swords with more thought, measuring not only how to protect, but how to strike. Even among the people, prayers began to shift, from prayers for the emperor's health to prayers for deliverance, though none dared speak the difference aloud. The figure who moved most quietly through these shadows was not the loudest voice, not the most powerful senator, but a man whose role had always been close, necessary, and overlooked. Cassius Chaerea, an officer of the Praetorian Guard, humiliated again and again by Caligula's taunts. The emperor mocked his voice as weak, his manner as effeminate, giving him orders in tones meant to belittle. In front of soldiers, in front of senators, in front of crowds, Chaerea had endured insult after insult. To strike the emperor was no longer only political, it was personal. He was not alone. Others too had felt the sting of humiliation, the burn of fear, the smothering weight of life under Caligula. Each man carried his own reasons, his own grudges, and though they did not yet form a single voice, their murmurs were beginning to find harmony. In Rome, conspiracies did not need open meetings. A nod across the forum, a hand resting too long on the hilt of a sword, a phrase in a letter destroyed before sunrise. These were enough. The city had long practiced the art of survival, and survival often meant speaking without speaking. The shadows themselves seemed to hold conversations, yet for all the whispers, for all the unspoken agreements, nothing was certain. To strike at an emperor was to gamble with not only one's life, but the life of one's family, one's friends, perhaps even the city itself. Failure meant not only death, but destruction. Rome had seen purges before, rivers of blood flowing through its streets in the name of vengeance. Every potential conspirator weighed this risk in silence. The emperor might be mad, but he was also guarded, also feared, also, despite everything, powerful beyond measure. Still, the weight of fear was pressing too heavily to ignore. Rome had endured, bent beneath his cruelty, but bending cannot last forever. A bow drawn too far will snap, and in the hush of night, in the quietest corners of the city, men who had once sworn loyalty to the emperor began to prepare for what could not be said aloud: an end. The streets carried on with their uneasy rhythms. Markets opened, senators debated trivial matters, the emperor staged his spectacles. But beneath the marble and the noise, beneath the incense and the games, the shadows lengthened, and within those shadows, enemies were drawing close, their patience sharpening like blades hidden beneath cloaks. Rome did not yet know it, but the ground beneath its emperor was beginning to tremble. The winter air of Rome hung heavy, though inside the palace the torches burned with feverish brightness. Laughter echoed down the corridors, the kind of laughter that did not carry joy, but demanded obedience. Slaves hurried with trays of silver, dishes piled with meat, amphorae of wine tilted endlessly into jewelled cups. The emperor had chosen another night of indulgence, another stage on which his cruelty and magnificence would blend into one spectacle. The banquet hall shimmered with gold. Drapes of purple hung like storm clouds above the long tables, their folds heavy with the scent of incense. Musicians played with careful precision, their melodies weaving through the clatter of cups and the uneasy murmurs of senators forced into merriment. No one arrived willingly. One did not decline the emperor's invitation. To sit at his table was a test of survival. Caligula himself presided as though a god among mortals. His robe of silk shimmered in the light, embroidered with images of Jupiter hurling thunderbolts, of Apollo crowned with laurels. A diadem rested upon his head, not of laurel, but of precious souvenirs, catching every flicker of fire until his face glowed with an otherworldly sheen. His eyes, sharp and restless, moved from guest to guest, as though searching for cracks in their smiles. Wine was poured, toasts demanded, and each man present lifted his cup high, though few dared to drink deeply. For to drink too quickly might suggest desperation, to drink too little might suggest defiance, and to spill a drop might invite death. Every gesture carried meaning, and every guest knew that their emperor delighted in finding insult where none was intended. Caligula's words filled the hall. He spoke of conquests not yet achieved, of wars he dreamed of waging against the gods themselves, of monuments so vast they would make the forum shrink to a pebble in comparison. His imagination roared unchecked, and those gathered were forced to nod, to laugh, to marvel at his visions. Yet behind each polite murmur lingered unease. For the emperor's feasts were never simply meals, they were performances, and the guests were players forced upon the stage. At times, as he ordered senators to dance like slaves, or noble women to strip as if in a brothel. At times he paused the music to demand executions, blood mingling with spilled wine on the marble floor. Nothing at these gatherings could be predicted. Pleasure and terror were served together. And so the hall glittered with forced splendour, while outside shadows gathered. In the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, whispers had hardened into decisions. The emperor had mocked too many, humiliated too deeply, stripped away too much dignity. A handful of officers, bound not by friendship but by necessity, had resolved that the night must end differently. Cassius Chaerea moved among them with the cold composure of a man who had suffered long. His hand often rested on the hilt of his sword, though no one noticed any more. Soldiers lived with steel at their sides. What they did not see was the resolve behind his calm gaze, the way his silence had sharpened into purpose. Tonight would be the night. Not because it was planned in some grand council, not because destiny had decreed it, but because the burden had grown too heavy to carry further. Inside the feast, the emperor's voice grew louder. He mocked senators for their grey hair, calling them relics unfit for the glory of his reign. He laughed at Chaerea himself, taunting him with insults meant to sting before the entire court. The hall roared with laughter, though none dared meet Chaerea's eyes. To show sympathy would have been fatal. To join the emperor's laughter was the only shield. Yet even this cruelty worked like a whetstone. Every insult made the blade in Chaerea's mind sharper, its point pressing closer to action. The hours stretched. Food became ash in the mouths of the guests. Wine turned bitter on their tongues. The emperor, restless and intoxicated, demanded entertainment. Dancers swirled, musicians strained their strings, acrobats flipped in desperate rhythm. Still, Caligula was not satisfied. His moods shifted with the wind, and when his joy faltered, danger always followed. At last he rose. His robe shimmered in the torchlight. His crown tilted as though even jewels could not rest comfortably on his head. He declared the night unfinished, that the feast must continue beyond the hall, into the corridors, into the very heart of his palace. He would walk among his people, he said, and the gods themselves would envy his revels. The guests stood, their movements choreographed by fear. They followed him into the colonnades, where shadows stretched long against the stone. The marble echoed with footsteps, with laughter too loud to be real, with the shuffle of slaves bearing torches. It was here, in the shifting darkness beyond the hall, that the moment approached. Charia's hand brushed the dagger hidden beneath his cloak. Others in the guard moved with him, their faces unreadable, their eyes fixed on the emperor's back. The air seemed to thicken, every sound amplified. The scrape of sandals, the hiss of torches, the hollow beat of hearts waiting for release. Caligula turned suddenly, his eyes flashing. For a moment, it seemed he sensed the danger. That paranoia had sharpened his instincts beyond even madness. He opened his mouth, perhaps to mock, perhaps to command. But before the words left his lips, steel flashed. Charia struck first. The dagger plunged deep, the blade finding its mark in flesh, long thought untouchable. The emperor's cry split the air. Not divine, not imperial, but human, raw, startled. Blood darkened his robe, jewels catching the torchlight, as though mocking his collapse. Others followed. Daggers, swords, desperate blows from men who had borne too much. Each thrust was fueled by humiliation, by fear, by years of watching cruelty fester unchecked. The marble floor that had borne so many forced performances now bore the weight of vengeance. Caligula struggled, staggered, but the circle closed around him. Guards who once bowed now struck. Senators who once clapped now watched in silence. Slaves froze in terror, knowing that to move was to invite suspicion. The emperor who had called himself a god now fell like any mortal, his blood seeping into the cracks of Rome's stone. The feast was over. The laughter ceased. Only the echoes remained. The echoes of steel, of a body collapsing, of a silence deeper than any the city had known. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The conspirators stood over the fallen figure, their breaths ragged, their eyes wide with the enormity of what they had done. To kill an emperor was not merely to end a life, it was to strike at the heart of empire itself. Rome would awaken to a different world, one built on the corpse that now lay cooling in the torchlight. And yet, in that stillness, no one spoke of the future. No one declared freedom, or peace, or a new dawn. They stood only in the presence of death, knowing that what began in shadows had now broken into the open, irreversible and consuming. The night held its breath. Rome slept, unaware that its emperor lay bleeding in his own palace, struck down not by distant enemies, not by rebellious provinces, but by those who had walked closest to him. And in the silence after the feast, the question lingered like a shadow across the city. What comes after a god falls? The torches in the corridor flickered low, their smoke curling against the marble like fading breath. The body that had once commanded Rome with thunderous cruelty lay still, surrounded by men who had sworn oaths of loyalty and then broken them in silence. For a moment, No one dared to speak. The air itself seemed unwilling to carry sound, as though the walls feared what words might follow. Caligula was dead. The emperor who had named himself divine, who had mocked gods and men alike, whose voice once filled the halls of power with promises of terror and indulgence, was now reduced to flesh cooling on stone. The jewels of his robe were dimmed with blood. His eyes, once alight with feverish visions, stared glassy and unseeing into the shadows above. The conspirators shifted uneasily. Their daggers, once so decisive, now felt heavy in their hands. To kill had been simple. To unmake an emperor was another matter entirely. For Rome was not a city that existed without rulers. A throne cannot remain empty for long, and every man present knew that the dawn would demand an answer. Whispers broke the silence. They spoke not of triumph, but of fear. What if the Praetorian Guard, divided as it was, turned upon itself? What if the Senate, long humiliated by Caligula, seized this chance to reassert its ancient power? What if the people, who had cheered his games and fed upon his spectacles, rose in anger at his death? No blade could silence these questions. The assassins withdrew into the night, leaving the body where it fell, as though distance might lessen the weight of their deed. Servants trembling crept forward only after the conspirators vanished, uncertain whether to flee or to cover the corpse. Some dared not touch it, fearing divine wrath, for even in death the emperor's madness clung to him like a shroud. Others wept quietly, not for love of the man, but for terror of what his absence would bring. Outside the palace walls, Rome slumbered in ignorance. The streets were quiet, the taverns dimmed, the marketplaces silent beneath the stars. The city that had once shaken under Caligula's proclamations now rested under a veil of fragile calm. Yet even in sleep, Rome seemed restless, as if some instinct whispered of change stirring in the dark. When the news spread at dawn, it moved not with the clarity of a proclamation, but with the murmur of rumour. A slave whispered to a merchant. A soldier muttered to his comrade. A senator passed a message in haste. The words stumbled at first, uncertain. Caligula is dead. Some laughed in disbelief, others paled as though struck. Yet the rumour spread, swift and unstoppable, until it reached every corner of the city. The Senate gathered, trembling with both fear and anticipation. Many had prayed for this day, but none had dared to believe it might come. Now, as they met in their chambers, they argued in hushed voices. Some demanded restoration of republican power, a return to the dignity of old Rome, free from the madness of emperors. Others, more cautious, warned that the army would never surrender the monarchy, and that chaos might swallow the empire whole. Their words collided like waves against stone, yet no decision could quiet the storm. Meanwhile, in the Praetorian barracks, confusion spread. Some soldiers mourned the emperor, not from love, but from loyalty forged in habit. Others rejoiced quietly, remembering insults, humiliations, and senseless cruelties inflicted upon them. The guard, meant to be the shield of the throne, now found itself uncertain whom it should protect, whom it should raise as the next sovereign. Without unity, its power was fragile, and the city knew it. Among the people, reactions were divided. There were those who whispered relief, recalling the emperor's madness, the unpredictable decrees, the public humiliations, the rivers of blood. Yet there were also those who grieved, for his feasts, his games, his spectacles had brought them moments of escape from hunger and toil. To some, he had been a tyrant. To others, a provider cloaked in cruelty. Yet beneath every reaction lingered unease. Rome was not safe when power trembled. An empire without a clear ruler was like a vast ship adrift on a restless sea, its oarsmen waiting for a captain's voice. And in that uncertainty, fear grew. The conspirators themselves did not emerge as heroes. They had struck a god in the dark. But gods, once slain, leave behind not reverence, but dread. The Senate hesitated to embrace them. The guard hesitated to trust them. Even the people hesitated to speak their names aloud. They were instruments of change, not masters of it. Their daggers had cut through flesh, but they could not carve the shape of the future. And so the city lingered in a strange twilight. The echo of madness had not faded with Caligula's death. It seemed to ripple outward, staining every chamber of power, every alleyway, every whispered conversation. Rome had been shaped by his cruelty, bent by his whims, and now, even in absence, his shadow stretched across the city. For the man who had mocked Jupiter and called himself divine had left behind more than fear. He had left uncertainty, suspicion, and the gnawing sense that power was no longer stable, no longer eternal. If an emperor who had seemed untouchable could fall to daggers in the dark, then what safety remained for those who followed? The palace halls were scrubbed, but the stains of blood lingered faintly on the stone, as though unwilling to depart. Slaves carried away the torn robes, the broken diadem, the remnants of a life lived in excess. Yet even stripped of his body, Caligula haunted the place. His laughter seemed to echo faintly in corners, his commands whispered in the rush of wind through colonnades. Madness does not die easily, it clings, it echoes, it burrows into memory. The senators spoke of transition, of stability, of restoring balance. The soldiers spoke of loyalty, of rewards, of who might command their devotion. The people spoke of survival, of bread, of what ruler might fill their empty bowls. Yet no voice could drown out the memory of the man who had filled Rome with terror and wonder alike. And as the city turned its gaze to the uncertain future, one truth settled upon every while the empire had been changed, not by conquests or laws, but by the feverish rule of a man who believed himself more than mortal. Caligula was gone, yet his reign had carved scars deep into Rome's soul. The echoes of his madness lingered. In every chamber where decisions were made, in every whisper of power, in every shadow where ambition stirred, his presence remained. Rome might move forward, but it would never walk untouched by the memory of the emperor who had called himself a god and had fallen like a man. And so the candles in Caligula's court burn out, one by one, leaving behind the scent of smoke, spilled wine, and memory. We have wandered together through marble halls where laughter hid daggers, where feasts became funerals, where love twisted into cruelty, and power devoured itself. We saw Rome hold its breath beneath Tiberius, waiting for something new. We watched a boy in little soldier's boots grow into a man draped in purple, adored by crowds who mistook a storm for sunlight. We felt the walls of the palace echo with incestuous whispers, with orgies dressed as rituals, with murders performed in the name of amusement. And then, when the weight of his madness grew too great, we stood in the shadows of the last feast, as blades found their mark, and the Emperor of Chaos was silenced by the very men who once bowed before him. Yet even as his body fell, the echoes of Caligula lingered. Rome carried his ghost in its bones, a reminder that beneath the grandeur of empire beats a heart that is all too human, capable of brilliance, yes, but also of cruelty, excess, and the madness of unchecked power. What we faced in this story was not just one man's descent, but the darker truth of history itself. That power without restraint can twist even hope into horror. That the cheers of the crowd can be as dangerous as the silence of fear. and that in Rome, as in life, madness and glory often sit side by side at the same table. If you've stayed with me through this journey, I hope the shadows of Caligula's reign will drift into the quiet of your night, not to frighten, but to remind you how fragile empires and men truly are. Before you let sleep take you, I'll ask just one thing. Subscribe to this channel, so these stories of forgotten emperors and haunted empires can find others like you. And if you'd like, leave your thoughts below. What struck you most in this tale of Rome's emperor of madness? Until next time, rest easy, and may the past whisper gently in your dreams.